Welcome back, degenerates, degeneritas, and degenerati, to the MMA RAXPOD for UFC 320, Ankalaev versus Pereira 2 from Las Vegas, Nevada. Thank you very much for tuning in. Please like, share, and subscribe to the YouTube channel and follow on X if you have not already. It's good to be back. UFC 319 was a blast. Didn't quite go the way I wanted because of Chase Hooper, but I did pretty well otherwise, both in terms of picks and just enjoying the experience overall. Awesome pay-per-view. This one, I can't lie. I've seen some people that are extremely excited, grading it as high as like a letter grade of like an A-. I gotta be honest. The fight that I'm most excited for out of all of these is the featured bout. Third from the top. Neither of the title fights are of great interest to me. I think the prelims, to be honest, are pretty lacking. I'm thankful that a lot of the fights are at least lined somewhat competitively, but the lines have slowly started to get blown out over the course of the week a little bit. But we'll get into everything in due time. Otherwise, as you may or may not be able to tell, I did get a new camera since the last RAXPOD. I had to upgrade my equipment a little bit for my other gig, if you're familiar with it. So shout out to one of my employers for hooking me up. I didn't choose this life. It chose me. I'm not one of those they make those jokes all the time about, oh, we got to stop selling people podcast equipment. I didn't buy my own. That's how I know I was meant to do this. I'm kidding. I don't know about, kidding about meant. I don't know if ment's a little strong. I'm happy to do this for all of you and keep it free forever. So I had 13 picks. We lost one of the fights during the week. As you can imagine, if you're familiar with the last time Ankalaev and Pereira fought, I was pretty eager to see Ozzy Diaz get slept. And you know what? I mean, look, it's not his fault that the fight was not scored correctly in the eyes of pretty much everybody that was watching that didn't have a ticket on Ozzy Diaz when he fought Jordan Santos at UFC 313. But that ended up costing me over 60 units in profit, which would have been probably one of, if not my most lucratively profitable pay-per-view event that I've done since I went public with this. I think it would have just been over when I had a clean sweep at UFC 298. That's how devastating that was. I would have had a sweep on underdogs, too, 4 for 4, if the Francis Marshall fight had been scored correctly against Marion Santos. So, and given the proximity of those two fights together, I have no problem saying that the judging was suspect at best and outright blasphemous at worst, especially given that card was also in Vegas, if memory serves correct. So, hopefully, we see a bit more just judging this time around. That being said, I'll be curious if some of these go to decision, which way they end up swinging. But I still do have 12 picks for this card. I was trying to record this Tuesday night. I'm recording this Wednesday, the day that I'm trying to get this up. There was a catastrophic, citywide internet outage yesterday, and I'm not making that up. You can read about it in the Post and Courier if you don't believe me. And I found out while I was still at my full-time gig that I was going to come home to no internet connection. And it didn't get restored until 11 o'clock last night. So I streamed Contender Series off of my phone. I don't need internet to record this show necessarily, but I do like having the odds up on screen and the Fight Center on ESPN, so I can just kind of quickly scroll through the fighters' recent performances and read off their records and whatnot, and I wasn't going to be able to do that. I was going to have to do that off of my phone and, laboriously flip through screens between segments of recording and then cut it up and everything. I just said, you know what, screw it. I'm just going to do it tomorrow when I have internet back. So that's what I'm doing now. So I am trying to get this out Wednesday night. That means I have to be pretty quick about trying to record this. Of course, the meme, if you've seen the show before, is I always say I'm going to do it quick, and I've got 12 fights to do, and then the show ends up being like north of 2.5 hours. There's a few stayaways I have on this card, and a few fights that even if I'm not staying off of, I don't necessarily want to go at super length on, so I am really going to try to be as quick as possible today. I don't know if I'm going to get it under 2 hours, but I do want to make sure that I get it done fast, because if I can't render this in time to put it up in the evening, it's not going to go up until tomorrow morning, and I'd rather not do that. I'd rather make it available for you all to have Wednesday night, and the show is, the shelf life for content like this rather isn't very long, so I'm going to do what I can to get this up Wednesday night. If you're listening to it Wednesday night, congratulations. If I didn't end up getting it done in time for Thursday, my condolences. I do what I can. At least it don't cost nothing, right? So with that in mind, let's get into it. And speaking of fights that I don't really care about, we'll start with the featured prelim on this card. By the way, Again, if I had more time, I probably would take a bit of a victory lap for, what happened last week with UFC Perth. Obviously, a very good event. Made the very wise decision to stay off of Noche UFC San Antonio, and thankfully didn't get reverse swept. Didn't have a good event at UFC Paris, but UFC Shanghai the week prior to that did do very well. So 2 of the last 4 events were very, very kind. And we're carrying really, really good momentum now into this pay-per-view. So pay-per-views have been pretty good over the course of the last, going back to like UFC 298. Even before that, I would say going all the way back to like UFC 290, 291 or so, 290. So we'll keep the good momentum going there. But yeah, don't really have a lot to offer on the last event other than it was good. I obviously went to Waffle House to celebrate. This is my crown of victory, if you will, and my sanctuary. It's my reward for making profit. So I would like to go to Waffle House again Sunday night. So I'll do everything I can to guide you all in the right direction ahead of this card. And there's certainly no shortage of paths to doing that. No shortage of candidates. I do have a couple underdogs, not a ton given the amount available, but. I anticipated a chalky card last week, and it mostly turned out to be that, at least for the spots that I was on. So with that in mind, we will get into UFC 320 right now, and we will start with Veronica Hardy and Brogan Walker. Hardy enters 9-5-1. Last appeared almost a year ago in November of last year at UFC 309, where she lost a unanimous decision to Eduarda Moira, the woman they call Brazilian Ronda, who is more reminiscent of Ronda in the sense of her ability to gas out late in fights as opposed to her ability to finish UFC caliber women in the first round. Conversely, Brogan Walker is 8-4 and has not appeared in 2.5 years, since April of 2023. That was Fight Night Pavlovich versus Blades, where she lost a unanimous decision to Yasmin Lucindo. Prior to that, I believe she was on the Ultimate Fighter finale, where she got knocked out just before the final minute of her fight with Juliana Miller, who has hardly fought since then, and I believe was only about 3-0 at the time that they fought then. So that should tell you a lot in terms of where she's been. And again, the same point that I made going into on this last show, which is that the stakes of the Ultimate Fighter are completely removed if the person that doesn't even end up winning the finale still ends up finding their way into the UFC, which is exactly what Brogan Walker has done here. And she's still getting fights 2.5 years later. I mean, this is 3.5 years removed from the tough finale she was in, but 2.5 years now from the last time she fought, hasn't won a fight in the UFC and is still getting booked. It kind of removes the stakes from your show if both competitors end up getting contracts anyway. But in the same way that Contender Series is kind of their talent incubator at this point for pretty much every new prospect signing they have, I don't know about pretty much ever. They've done a good job of signing people from more regional promotions this year, I think. Even if some of those recent signings haven't worked out. One of which is a fight further up these prelims that I'm not going to talk about because the Polish guy is a debutant, so no read there. But obviously, Patchy Mix didn't do so hot in his debut against Mario Batista. Now, at this point, you're probably wondering, why isn't he talking about Hardy versus Walker? And that's because Hardy is a minus 800 favorite at the time that I'm recording this, which is absurd. I mean, there's no value on that on its face. Now, do I think Walker has a realistic chance of winning this fight? Probably not, but it simply isn't worth it when a fighter is an 8-1 favorite at this point, or I guess 1-8, whatever you want to call it. Point is, minus 800, you're betting $800 to win 100. There's no way that that's worth it, particularly for someone in Hardy who, I mean, we can chastise Walker for not fighting in 2.5 years, but Hardy's been on the shelf for almost a year herself. Now, you would think, given that hilarious picture that she took with Sean Strickland, where she relayed that as part of his suspension for assaulting the opponent of the person he was cornering after their fight, and I don't know if we ever got I think he was indefinitely suspended, or maybe it was for at least 6 months, but point is, Hardy relayed that he was getting his suspension potentially reduced by coaching up women's MMA, and she and I think Hannah Goldie were both, kind of grinning slyly at the fact that Strickland was having to stand between them and coach them, and Strickland was just standing there looking miserable. It's a great photo. If you haven't seen it, I highly recommend looking it up. So Hardy's at least training under Strickland. You would think Strickland would have her ready for a woman from Guam that has not fought in 2.5 years and doesn't have a UFC victory. If there's any points of confidence here for Walker, she is going to have a reach advantage of 3 inches, and she is a little bit more consistent going the distance in her career with one more fight of experience doing so than Hardy is. And that's about it. I guess the other thing for her is that she's never been submitted. I would think Hardy probably has an easier time finding a submission here as opposed to knocking out Walker, despite the fact that Walker has been finished before. But again, that was only in the final, almost the final minute of her fight with Juliana Miller. So I mean, again, there's Hardy, there's no reason that she shouldn't win this fight. I mean, and she can pretty much take it any way that she wants to. Walker, in both of her appearances, hasn't landed a takedown. I mean, her takedown defense is only 11%. So it's pretty much any way that Hardy wants to take this fight, she can. It's just a question of whether or not she's going to finish the fight or whether it's going to go the distance. And if it does go the distance, it's fair to speculate if she's going to have the cardio to keep it on her terms for all 15 minutes. From there, it could just come down to who wins the second round. And you would expect Walker to do that handily, but what if something weird happens, That's a very open-ended way of saying that you shouldn't bet on something, because I'm not giving you a specific of what could happen in the second round. But again, I mean, minus 800, I don't think there's a single person there's not a single male, female fighter, period, in pretty much any matchup that I think I could imagine that I would ever recommend betting out at minus 800. I think the furthest I've gone to minus 500 on record. I think that the highest grade I've ever given in terms of being comfortable betting in that range would probably be, I think I've only gotten up there once. I think it might have been when Tom Nolan was fighting Alex Reyes. And I don't remember what I said I would have bet him out at, but I think it was probably something like, I think it was either minus 600 or 700, and he was priced even higher than that, and I ended up taking the under, and that didn't work out. But the point is, there's no value here, so don't waste your time. And to the point of not wasting your time, I don't think it's worth speculating whether she's going to finish this woman or not. You can very lazily write it off as, oh, she's way younger, closer to her prime. Walker hasn't fought in 2.5 years. She's not going to be sharp, so she's probably going to get finished. But this is women's MMA. You're much more likely to see a decision than a finish. So if you could feel very strongly that this fight is going to go one way, and then it's just kind of hard to get a read on, given neither of these women have competed in pretty much a year at least. In the case of Walker, it's even more than that. So you really don't know what you're getting. And to the point of Hardy being able to take this fight wherever she wants it to, like maybe she does elect to grapple more, and Walker's never been submitted, and it's possible that she's able to deploy successful enough submission defense to keep it that way. At the same time, maybe Hardy elects to strike, and both of these women have negative striking differentials for their UFC careers. So maybe she encounters more resistance than she would otherwise be anticipating, and Walker is going to have the reach advantage in a larger octagon than the tight one they have at the Apex. So it's certainly possible, I think, that if this does stay at distance, Walker has a little bit more measured success than people are anticipating. Just don't overthink this. Don't think about this period. You know, people make the joke all the time about going to the bathroom during women's MMA events and whatever, and I don't recommend that for every women's fight, but my point is, don't feel like you got to rush to your television at 6 o'clock because you can't miss a single one of the early prelims here. They just opened a Wild Wings a couple months ago that I went to. It was the same week that UFC 318 came on. It's one of the only places around here that I know is actually going to have the pay-per-view on and not have a crowd where the average person is above like 60 years old. So I'm going to be going there, but I'm probably going to leave the house around 6 o'clock or possibly when this fight starts, because I know I don't need to see it. So I'm budgeting my time appropriately. I hope you do the same. I expect Hardy to win by like 30-27 decision going away, but I'm not going to cry over spilt milk if I get it wrong, whether it's the method of victory for Hardy or whether Walker ends up upsetting her. I would feel comfortable betting Hardy at like 200, but this line is already blown out, and people are just blindly fading the fact that Walker's probably not very good and hasn't fought in a while, which is fair, but that doesn't mean you have to jump on it at minus 800 in Hardy. So don't overthink this. Just stay away. The next fight is Austin Vanderford and Ramiz Brahimaj. Okay, that was like 7 minutes I think I just spent on Walker Hardy, and that was like maybe 6 more minutes than I probably should have given for a fight that I'm trying to stay away from. Forgive me. Anyway, Vanderford is 13-2, last fought at Fight Night Cejudo versus Song, UFC Seattle, I believe, all the way back in February, where he took that fight on short notice at a catch weight of 175 pounds, and was able to pretty thoroughly dominate Nikolay Veretennikov, who's fighting in the fight after this, and dominated him as an underdog. Conversely, Ramiz Brahimaj is 12-5, last fought at Fight Night Blanchfield versus Barber this year, where he scored a massive upset on what I believe was short notice against Billy Ray Goff, totally choking him to sleep with a front standing guillotine, I believe, in the first round. I was on the MMA Oddsbreaker podcast for that show. I believe that was the week after I did the UFC Fight Pass show with Yanni the Greek and Nick Kalikas, Gambler's Perspective. And I remember Adam Martin and I had the same take, which was, we felt like Goff should win, but we weren't interested. We thought it was crazy that he was opening like minus 500 or something. It was way too high. And Marcel Dorff, to his credit, believed in his guy Brahimaj, took him to win, and he got it done for the second fight in a row. Now on a nice two-fight win streak after looking like he had nothing left against Garimbo, because he hardly did anything in that fight all the way back in May of last year. Now, those two recent results kind of made me reassess things with Brahimaj a little bit, because I was one of those people that thought he was absolutely cooked after that Garimbo performance, so I made Mickey Gall a parlay leg at UFC 309. Excuse me, that did not go so well. And the craziest thing about that, I mean, you can kind of call it a mean performance, but he still earned it. And, I mean, Gall's been knocked out before, so it wasn't like he, broke somebody's chin that had never experienced it. But, I mean, it's usually a red flag when a guy is this many fights into his UFC career and doesn't have a knockout period in his entire MMA career yet. And that was the first time that Brahimaj has ever knocked out an opponent. And not only did he do that, but he knocked him out with one punch. It's a very difficult thing to nail down in this sport. I think a lot about when, Conor McGregor was in the Mystic Mac phase of his career. And, through all the craziness and the coke binges and whatever, there's rare moments of brilliant insight from that guy that, explains how he was able to become the Mystic Mac figure and the larger-than-life personality that he represents both in MMA and the sports world at large. And I think back to that interview where they tried, I can't remember what the question was specifically, but they were asking him about, what really goes into a one-punch knockout. And he spoke about how there's kind of a myth around it being, just athleticism and strength and whatever. And he spoke more about how it really comes down to placement and precision and technique much more than anything else. And so it's so hard to nail down whether a fighter has one punch lights out power at any weight class other than heavyweight, because once you get up to a certain point, it's like most guys are going to be able to just wreck pretty much anybody. But for pretty much all the other weight classes, there's examples of guys that don't sit down on their punches, and you go and you look through at their records, and they may have a handful of knockouts on their resume, but they've all been more attritional knockouts or ground and pound strikes or even kicks or knees or elbows. It's not actually just one punch coming on the end of a hook or a jab or an uppercut that puts their opponent's lights out. So it's one of the most important factors to account for in terms of evaluating fights, but you can be easily fooled by the circumstances of under when it happens, or if a fighter is capable of it despite having never demonstrated it themselves. My general policy, because I take a very long-term approach in terms of not getting too worked up about what happens in the short term, whether I take a bad beat or whether I have a very successful evening, is to give fighters the benefit of the doubt when they demonstrate that they are capable of something. That's why I don't think what happened with Brahimaj against Gall was a fluke or entirely on Gall just being bad or having a bad chin. Brahimaj knocked him out with one punch. I mean, he was getting the better of him on the striking anyway, but he put him down and put him away with one shot. And he's training at a good gym. I believe he's at Fortis MMA. If memory serves correct. I just want to confirm that real quick before I make the further make the point. Last time I checked, he is at Fortis MMA. So it's a gym that I respect a lot. And we'll get into why I'm concerned. One other fighter apparently has moved away from that gym up the card. We'll get to that in a bit. But training at a great gym, it would stand to reason that guy coming back from I think it was a spine injury he was dealing with that cost him a lot of his, 2 years of his career between 2022 and 2024 before he came back and fought Garimbo. a gym like that would be able to help a guy get back to or regain not only regain the form of where he was as a fighter, but continue to round out and level up the gaps in his game where that would make themselves apparent when he goes out and actually competes in the octagon, which is what Brahimaj has done now 2 fights in a row, despite the market continuing to doubt him. Here we are again. And I've invoked this on the show before. I'm not a big J. Cole fan, but it's like the guy said, fool me one time, shame on you. Fool me twice, can't put the blame on you. Fool me 3 times, F the peace sign, something, chopper, let it rain on you. He's been a massive underdog. He wasn't a massive underdog against Gall, but he was the underdog. He closed and there was a lot of closing movement in on Gall because people thought Brahimaj was done. And he got a huge win in front of his local New York crowd. And then goes out to the Apex and beats Goff on short notice circumstances when he's another big underdog. And now he's a big underdog here too against a guy that has had 1 UFC appearance on short notice, not even at this weight class. Vanderford had a very good showing against Veretennikov. And when you're charting this fight in theory, I can understand why people would believe that Vanderford should be not only a favorite, but a considerable favorite here. Brahimaj does not have he is below average takedown defense, and the theme with Vanderford's fights is when he gets them to the ground, he's got very, very good ground offense. He's both a credible submission threat, at least by average UFC fighter standards, and he's got very, very good ground and pound. He's very active down there. The likelihood that a ref is going to have to ask him to work while he's in top position if he gets there isn't very high. That was demonstrated not only against Veretennikov, but also in his Dana White Contender Series appearance that was all the way back in 2018 when he was in or approaching his prime. He's now 35 years old. That fight on Contender Series in 2018 was against a guy named Angelo Trevino, who has fought 5 times professionally in the 7 years since then. If you go back and watch that Contender Series fight, which you can if you have Fight Pass, he loses the first round. Vanderford loses the first round to Trevino. He gets knocked down. He gets outlanded like 30-13 on significant strikes. He had to come back, and he wobbled Trevino in his own right that led to kind of a weird scramble that didn't involve any takedowns, but ended up putting Trevino in a position where I think he conceded his back and then ended up getting choked out. But Vanderford had to rally back to win that fight. He got knocked down, though, and that fight was at 170 pounds. He took a fight in LFA last year that was at 170, where he won within the first 90 seconds against some basically nobody. But 3 fights after that Contender Series appearance, he was already up to 185 fighting at middleweight. And that's where basically his entire Bellator career took place. And then the Veretennikov fight was a catchweight fight. So he hasn't had to make 170 for a year. And the last time that he fought an opponent that was on the precipice of being UFC caliber at 170, he got dropped in the first round. The other concerning thing is that his last 2 fights in Bellator, he was up at 185 pounds, and he was fighting 2 guys that had previously been in the UFC in Gegard Mousasi. I believe he was previously in the UFC, and Aaron Jeffrey. I think Aaron Jeffrey was previous. Well, maybe he was one of those Bellator to PFL imports, but okay, Jeffrey was never in the UFC, but he was on Contender Series twice. That's why because I remembered seeing his name within the stats. So he didn't actually get a UFC fight. Mousasi had several UFC fights, but he's also 40 years old. He just turned 40 in August. So He would have been in his late 30s at the time that he fought Vanderford back in 2022 and was still able to knock him out within 90 seconds. Both of those fights that Vanderford had at 185 against those guys, he got knocked out at the same exact time. The fights both lasted a minute and 25 seconds, and he got knocked out in the first round in both of those. And that was up at 185. Now he's taking weight off of his chin after suffering back-to-back knockouts on the back half of his career, moving down to 170 against a guy that has a one-punch knockout within his last 2 fights. And somehow Vanderford is a 300 favorite. I'm sorry, I just don't see it. I see how he could win this fight and potentially look 300 if it goes the way that he needs it to go. But who's to say it's going to go the way he needs it to go? All 3 of these rounds are going to start on the feet. Granted, Brahimaj has never won a decision, so if it does get to the 3rd round, it's unlikely that he's probably going to have the starching power left, if you will, to put Vanderford away. But if you're going to give me plus 250 on the underdog here, when I think there's clearly the knockout upside on his side, submission upside is probably on Brahimaj's side as well, just because he's a much more accomplished grappler than Vanderford is. I think Vanderford is kind of decision or bust in this spot. And if it does go the distance, he almost certainly wins again, because Brahimaj has never won one. But on a very general average, decision versus finish is basically 50-50. I'm not saying it's a 50-50. It should be 50-50. I kind of am, though, because I very barely have Brahimaj graded to win this. I think he's got pretty much all of the finishing upside. But I can see how Vanderford gets a finish with ground and pound if he gets Brahimaj in a precarious position where he's not putting up a good visual in terms of defending himself on the ground. But he's a responsible enough grappler that I imagine he'll be able to stymie he'll at least be able to responsibly defend himself from his back if it does get to that point where Vanderford is able to get to where he's most comfortable. But while this is on the feet, if guys like Angelo Trevino are dropping Vanderford when he's supposed to be in his prime at 170, I don't see why Brahimaj can't do it when Vanderford is 35 years old. So I have to go with Brahimaj here as the underdog. And I'm going to say that he gets a first-round knockout, the second one of his career. And if it's not a first-round knockout, it could just as easily be a club and sub. But I think that, and I think a sneaky prop here could be Ramiz Brahimaj to land one knockdown. If you're one of those prop people that's interested and doesn't necessarily want to pick the winner here, but I think you could probably get a pretty good price on that, regardless of what it is. Give me Brahimaj to win by first-round knockout. I'm taking him as the underdog. I think he's got much better finishing upside here than Vanderford does. If this goes the distance, I think Vanderford wins, but I don't expect it to based on where he's at in his career and the career moves he's made to get to this point and what Brahimaj has shown recently in terms of improvement. Give me Ramiz, round 1. I know Marcel will be happy if it takes place. The next fight is Punahele Soriano and Nikolay Veretennikov. Soriano enters 11-4, last appeared at Fight Night Dern versus Rebus 2, the first event in the UFC this year, all the way back in January, where Soriano was a pretty healthy underdog against Uros Medic. Nevertheless, Soriano proved that his move down to 170 continues to be the right decision for him in his UFC career. He scored the biggest win of his UFC career, knocking out Medic 1 second after the first 30, so inside of a minute, and proved that the power that he had at 185 did translate down to 170 with his move down. Conversely, Veretennikov last competed a short while ago at UFC 318, getting a split decision over Francisco Prado that pretty much everybody watching that didn't bet Veretennikov thought he lost. I'm not just saying that because I picked Prado. I didn't make Prado a parlay leg, so I didn't have a lot invested in that fight. If you go back and you watch my breakdown from that show, I talked about how volatile of a matchup it was and that you probably shouldn't invest heavily into it anyway. That being said, I still don't think the decision was scored correctly. The people that I was watching the fight with at Buffalo Wild Wings that saw it also were surprised that Veretennikov was made the winner, and most people that I was assessing their opinions of in or around social media after the fact didn't agree with the decision. So it's still baffling to me that Veretennikov got that, especially in wake of how he behaved after he was beaten by Austin Vanderford, shoving his opponent, just kind of putting himself in bad graces. A lot of people thought he was going to get cut immediately after he behaved like that, or at least suspended. It's not like he threw a punch, but, he did go over to the guy's corner and shove him after the fact, even though Vanderford didn't do anything other than his job and do it well. So bad behavior, didn't have a UFC win at that point. Surprised that they gave him a close fight in what I thought Prado was probably going to get. And Prado, I don't think, has ever won a decision himself in his MMA career, so it would have been nice for him to get that one. It was unfortunate it didn't quite go his way. A lot of people are confidently picking Soriano in this spot. I mean, I think that he should win. He opened 300. I thought that was a little bit too expensive. Earlier in the week when I put the pick out, he was a lot cheaper. I think it was around the 230 range. Yeah, 220. He since has jumped back up to around 280. I think a lot of people are kind of blindly fading Veretennikov. I do think that there is a little bit of risk here in the sense that Soriano is somebody that has been knocked out before. He was knocked out by Kopylov, and that fight was up at 185. Has come down to 170, so you hope his chin is going to be able to hold up. It didn't really get tested in the fight with Miguel Baeza because he controlled so much of it. And against Medic, that fight didn't even last long enough for us to get a sense of, if Medic was actually going to be able to test out his damage tolerance or not. Veretennikov has been knocked out twice, but those were both very well. Okay, so he got knocked prior to the Vanderford fight. He got knocked out very early in his MMA career, all the way back in 2014. The Vanderford fight, he never really went out, which was kind of what prompted the whole. I wouldn't call it a brawl, but it's why he got angry after the fact, was because he was mad the ref stopped it. It was a good stoppage because he wasn't really defending himself, but you saw him immediately protest because he didn't really feel like he was absorbing a lot of the shots, which was something the commentary pointed out. It still wasn't a good visual. He wasn't really fighting back or getting out of the position. He just seemed kind of resigned to his fate, even if he wasn't really taking compromising damage. So it's not like the guy has shown in his brief UFC appearances, really, really horrible damage tolerance, which is a little bit surprising given he was someone that got knocked out so early in his MMA career. But you would think someone like Danny Barlow, who hits very hard, would have been able to take advantage of that, even though I know Barlow broke his hand or whatever, but we don't need to get into that. On paper, there's a lot of reasons to like Soriano here. Clearly the more well-rounded guy, according to the numbers, is going to be the more active fighter. Southpaw versus Orthodox matchup. Much more demonstrable power, even though I think Veretennikov has at least one or a couple one-punch knockouts on his own resume prior to the UFC, so I think the guy hits pretty hard in his own right. I think that is probably why he was considered to be the favorite over Vanderford, because, again, Vanderford wasn't down to 170, but it was a catch weight at 175. Him previously being in Bellator, getting knocked out at the end of his career there 2 times in a row. People probably thought Veretennikov, if the fight stayed standing, was going to be able to put him out pretty quickly. And Vanderford did a good job of putting that fight on his terms, putting it on the ground and not giving Veretennikov any room to operate or get up. for pretty much as long as the fight lasted in the case of both rounds. So in theory, you would think Soriano, with the glimpses of wrestling we've seen over his UFC career, would be able to do the same thing, if not outright knock him out on the feet. Problem is, one of the things that was so encouraging about the Baeza fight was that he was able to dominate for all 15 minutes, because this was previously a guy that, if he wasn't landing his early bombs, wouldn't necessarily gas out, but would kind of lose a sense of what he really wanted to do and would end up not having good performances in fights that had gone the distance. That was only the second fight in his MMA career that he had won by decision. The only other previous one was against Jamie Pickett, the Nightwolf, on Contender Series all the way back in 2019. Performance that I guess he did get signed off of that, because that's a little surprising. I wouldn't have expected that. That being said, he lost a unanimous decision to Brendan Allen. It's hard to fault him for that, because Allen's obviously done very well climbing the rankings at 185. And then against Nick Maximov, I think he got hurt in the third round. Like, something happened with his knee or something, and so he wasn't able to really defend takedowns. So Maximov was able to take advantage of him in the third round and ended up getting a split decision. I did pick Maximov as an underdog. That was one of the last fight events before I started actually running analysis on all of these cards. So I think there's still a little bit of reason to be skeptical about Soriano's gas tank, but one of the things that comes with the benefit of moving down in weight is that typically, and this is something that I think people argue about a lot, but typically cardio actually improves. A lot of people think that when you're putting more of a weight cut on yourself to move down in a weight class, that they actually come into the fight more compromised, and so they're not able to perform well late. I think it depends on fighter to fighter. Soriano had, I don't want to say he visibly got smaller moving down from 185 to 170, but I think other people would agree that he looks like he took mass off from himself without really compromising the strength that made him a formidable UFC talent when he was fighting up at 185. So I feel like that the move down to 170, at least from the Baeza fight, demonstrated that it assisted his cardio, that he wasn't carrying as much weight into the third round. But again, that was only one fight. We have to see what happens if this fight does get extended. Fortunately for him, Veretennikov is somebody that has not traditionally performed well late into fights and has not performed well when being taken to the ground. So if this fight stays standing for all 15 minutes, I can see a world in which Veretennikov takes a 29-28 decision, particularly if he's more successful earlier in the fight, or if Soriano ends up getting tired because he opted to wrestle early, didn't get a finish, and is suddenly more tired than he otherwise would have been. At the same time, you wonder about how much energy he's actually going to use against an opponent like Veretennikov that hasn't really done a good job with showing get-up game and getting off of his back against competent ground fighters in his MMA career. So I feel like Soriano will probably get a 29-28 decision here, possibly even a 30-27. I could also see him getting a knockout early. I think he's probably got more finishing upside than Veretennikov does here. That being said, I could still see Veretennikov getting a knockout of his own. Or if this fight is just a 15-minute kickboxing match, I think that probably is his best path to victory as opposed to any other direction this fight can go. But Soriano's the more well-rounded fighter, more UFC experience, clearly. I think has shown more demonstrable power against more quality opponents than what Veretennikov has. And despite having his own bit of sketchy cardio based on his history at 185, Soriano is still somebody that has been more successful going the distance than Veretennikov has in his own MMA career. So give me Soriano to win 29-28 decision. But I expect an encouraging performance from him, and I would expect Veretennikov gets cut after that. Maybe not gets cut now that he's not on an outright losing streak, but I do think he should have been cut after what happened with the Vanderford fight. He probably gets one more shot against, I would guess, some other winner from the latest season of Contender Series that competed at 170, but we'll see what happens. In any event, I like this weight class for Soriano. He's only 32 years old. It'll be interesting to see what happens with him over the next couple of years. I don't ever see him being a contender in this at 170 or anything, given how deep the division is, but I think he could be an interesting challenge for a lot of fighters, particularly ones that are susceptible to getting knocked out. So we'll see what they do with him. But I like him. I've liked him for pretty much the entire time I've been doing this. I'll be curious to see where he goes from here, assuming that he gets the job done Saturday. But I think he does. The next fight is Macy, Chiasson, and Yana Santos. Chiasson enters 11-4, last fought at Fight Night Blanchfield Barber, where she lost a unanimous decision to Ketlen Vieira, a fight that was somewhat controversial given Vieira was admitted to the hospital during her weight cut, was discharged from the hospital, and able to get the fight moved up to, I think it might have been a catch weight of 140, but it could have been as high as 145. I don't recall the details, but yeah, there were jokes being made about how, I thought they got rid of women's featherweight, even though that's basically what this fight was at. But yeah, made Chiasson go through the entire weight cut, then got the fight moved to weight that she could actually compete at. She looked remarkably fresher than Chiasson, especially for a fighter that had basically been discharged from the hospital, leading some people to speculate, did she end up getting an IV? Is that a legal way to get an IV, which would otherwise not be allowed to be administered under most, I think pretty much every athletic commission? People have speculated Makhachev cheats that way for years. But yeah, that's what happened to poor Chiasson, who was in I think a pick'em for that fight. I backed her pretty confidently. So did, again, that was the card that I did my first appearance on MMA Odds Breaker for with Adam Martin, Marcel Dorff. We all thought Chiasson would win. She did. One judge gave her round 3. One judge gave her round 1. I don't know how a judge gave her round 1, but there was an argument for giving her that win, at least on that basis, even though I don't think that you could give her round 1. So I was kind of holding out hope that she would be given a bit of what would have been a robbery given the circumstances, but they didn't end up rewarding her, unfortunately. Conversely, Yana Santos last fought at Fight Night Sandhagen Figueiredo. I think that was UFC Des Moines, against Miesha Tate, who hadn't competed in some time. She got pretty thoroughly dominated in the last round of the fight, but Tate took too long to settle in, so it was a pretty clear-cut 29-28 for Santos. After the fight, a lot of people were talking about how she looked way more jacked, I think, than she had previously, because she hadn't fought in almost a year at that point, which was funny considering she not only trains at American Top Team, but obviously used to be, I think, Yana Kunitskaya, before she became Yana Santos, because she is the wife of former UFC title challenger Thiago Santos. And Santos had obviously been busted for PEDs before previously, so I made the joke that Santos must have raided her husband's medicine cabinet prior to this fight. Either way, she's probably getting some pretty good vitamins from American Top Team. Now, so the other joke here, of course, is, poor Chiasson, just got done fighting one cheater that beat her because of the cheating pretty clearly, and is now getting rewarded with a second straight fight against someone who is potentially pretty blatantly cheating herself. So poor Chiasson is just going to have to battle through it, I guess. But the other interesting thing here is I had a very strong grade on Chiasson. But I had a strong grade on her against Vieira too. So, and even though much different stylistic fighter than Santos is, it's giving me some pause in terms of the grade that I have on her. One thing that does make it take a bit of a ding that I didn't find out until the day I'm recording this, as opposed to when I ran all the analyses for these fights last weekend, is apparently Chiasson has said in interviews that she switched teams since her last fight. She was previously training at Fortis MMA, as I alluded to in the Brahimaj breakdown earlier on this podcast. She was the fighter that had left Fortis, based on what she's indicated. Now, on its face, I never think it's a good call to leave what I consider to be a very good gym. It's even worse when you leave, unless you're going to a gym of similar quality, which I believe that she's in Louisiana. So if she's now at a more local place, I didn't actually catch which is the new camp that she's at, but I would be skeptical, given not only are you leaving what's a pretty renowned gym, but your opponent is training at what is probably the best gym in the world, if only because of the resources and quantity of high-level UFC talent available at American Top Team. There's a reason that fighters from around the globe make a point of moving to South Florida to be able to train at American Top Team. There's other gyms that are very high quality. The point I was going to make a couple of minutes ago before getting into this whole thing about gyms is that you saw the value of what training at a world-class camp means on the card last week, in which you had a banner night for city kickboxing up and down the card. Whether it was Carlos Ulberg, Navajo Sterling, pretty much all the fighter, and I'm forgetting the name of the guy that beat Andre Petrosky, Cam Rouston, I think. But banner night for city kickboxing. World-class gym makes a big difference here. It's a very important technical variable that I consider among all of the ones that I look at for all of the fighters. So Chiasson saying that she leaves Fortis MMA, that doesn't make me feel super confident. I still have her graded strong enough that I would bet her in the 2-1 range that she's settled in around at. She was starting to drop when I put the pick out earlier this week when she was minus 175. She's now minus 200 at the time that I'm recording this. She opened minus 300, which was too strong for me. And I think that people were wise to bet that down, because if she doesn't fight to her strengths, which I don't think she necessarily did against Ketlin Vieira, then there's a world in which Santos ends up winning this. Santos is also has nearly twice as much experience as Chiasson does going the distance. Has been a bit better of a consistent performer going the distance as well. I think if you look at the finishing upside between these two, it's clearly Chiasson. I mean, Santos has been knocked out 3 times and submitted twice. Hasn't been knocked out since 2021 when she fought Irene Aldana, but you would think that Chiasson is going to have, given that how massive she is for the division and Santos being a little bit smaller and not very accomplished on the ground, pretty much all of the finishing upside in this fight is going to be for Chiasson, whether it's knockout or submission. But I can see a world in which Santos is able to outpoint her despite having the disadvantages in the length, if for no other reason that she is the more active and accurate striker and also more defensively responsible. So if Chiasson doesn't come into this fight with a specific plan in mind in terms of where she wants to go, Santos definitely has a path to victory here. So I am picking Chiasson, but despite the fact that the grade is strong, what I've seen recently just makes me less confident, to where I don't know if I can just outright deploy her as a parlay leg this week. If I knew that Chiasson was going to make a point of putting this fight on the ground from the jump, given Santos has below average, not terrible, but below average takedown defense, and Chiasson is the much more accomplished fighter on the ground, I would pick Chiasson with a lot of confidence. But I don't know that she's going to fight to her strengths, and I don't know if she's going to have the best game plan ready, especially given that she just left what is a very good gym, and I don't think her gym is the reason that she lost her last fight, as much as it is Vieira straight up got away with cheating. So I want to believe Chiasson wins. I'm going to say that she has a good performance and gets a second round submission here after fighting the right strategy and putting this fight on the ground in the first 2 rounds and eventually finding a submission. That being said, I can't be supremely confident that she's going to do that. And if she does try to make the most of her length advantage against a woman that's a much better striker than a grappler, she could end up finding herself in a position where she ends up giving up the first round and then has to win back the last 10 minutes convincingly, and maybe she doesn't do that with the second round. Maybe she does it with the second round, but Santos has enough left to have a more impressive third round, and she ends up losing a unanimous or split 29-28 decision based on what happened in the last 10 minutes of the fight. So if you're more of a live bettor, you might want to wait and see with this one in terms of how the first round plays out. Because if Santos does end up winning the first round here, I'd feel pretty good about her getting this fight, to be honest. I think the first round is going to go figure, but I think the first round is going to tell us a lot about which direction this fight goes. But if Chiasson comes out and makes a point of putting this on the floor, I think she's going to do really well. And I'm going to assume that based on the fact that she needs a bounce back performance, that she's going to fight the smart strategy and play to her strengths here. So give me Chiasson by second round submission. The first fight on the main prelims, the second fight on the main prelims at UFC 320 is Daniel Santos and Ju Sang Yu. Santos enters 13-2, last competed at UFC 315, where he took a unanimous decision over another Korean prospect, Zhang Yong Lee. I believe Lee was a previous Road to UFC winner. That's correct. Won Road to UFC over Yi Za by split decision at Fight Night Lewis versus Spivak back in 2023. Zhang Yong Lee got knocked out in that insane fight with Haider Emil, and then didn't compete for nearly a year until he fought Santos. That was Santos moving up to featherweight. I took Zhang Yong Lee thinking that Santos was going to have a difficult time dealing with how big of a prospect Zhang Yong Lee is, even by featherweight standards. And Lee had a horrible performance. I think got knocked down in the first round and basically it never got any momentum going from that. Santos pretty considerably dominated that fight, despite the fact that I think I remember that fight bouncing around back and forth between being kind of a pick'em, similar to where this one was at the over the previous weekend before the week of the card. But Santos has settled into being a small favorite here now, which I think is largely built off of that performance. Ju Sang Yu is 9-0 and had one of the knockouts of the year at UFC 316 when he put Jeka Sergi out in the first 30 seconds. In literally one of those knockouts where, it's so funny. They invoke the McGregor comparison whenever they can, but Joe Rogan literally compared it to Aldo McGregor when he caught Aldo coming forward with the left hook, and Aldo just kind of went timber. That's exactly what Sergi did. Sergi face planted, was out for several minutes. Scary knockout, but again, Sergi was the kind of fighter that would lose to Weston Wilson, in spite of what some people may have thought was going to happen in that fight. But some of us also picked him to knock out Lucas Alexander. So, it comes and goes both ways. Volatile matchup. Santos, I've faded this guy in all 3 of his fights. I talked about it before, I think, even on the 315 breakdown, how I was sitting with all of my friends watching, or high school associates back when he was fighting Castaneda, picked Castaneda feeling good about it. Castaneda has a good first round, and Santos has a crazy comeback and knees him against the fence and puts him out that way. Sensational knockout. But has had problems making bantamweight and pulled out of various fights over the 3 years since then, and only had competed twice up to that point. I think I picked Johnny Munoz. I might have said to stay away, but I either picked Munoz or said stay away, or I actually think I might have. I took the under, thinking that one of them was going to finish the other, and Munoz got kicked, like one of the worst groin kicks in recent memory, where he had to get like a catheter after the fight or something. He, not to laugh at his pain, but the guy basically spent the rest of the fight being like, okay, well, I'm in incredible pain. I don't want to get finished though. So I'm just basically going to hold guard and lean on my grappling experience to keep me safe in a violent situation for the however much longer the fight has to last. I think he got kicked once in the first round, and then right at the beginning of the third round it happened again. And he wanted to continue. I think they took a point from Santos, but he was in a position where he's like, I'm in too much pain, but I don't want to, check out. So, it was. The point is, I'm 0 for 3 in terms of Santos fights, but I've just never had a great read on the guy. And I recognize that putting a lot of stock into the numbers here really isn't going to do you much, because again, you has 30 seconds of UFC experience. So whatever you're trying to gain out of raw stats here, you're not going to gain much insight. But even if I disregard the numbers in terms of what the grade is, and I just look at the other variables that go beyond their UFC experience, there's still reasons to like you here. He's going to have a 4-inch reach advantage. He's never lost, so I think he's at least coming into this fight more confident than Santos is. And this is, again, Santos, a guy that struggled to make bantamweight, now going up to featherweight, where he is going to be a bit of a smaller featherweight, I would think. Use not the same physical presence that Zhang Yang Li is, but the guy has been, he is the understudy, I guess, to Chan Sung Jung, the Korean Zombie. So the fact that such an impressive fighter, one of the best Korean fighters ever, is looking at this guy and giving him the vote of confidence in terms of bringing him along, something that you has gone out of his way to credit Jung with publicly in terms of bringing him along, has to make you at least reasonably optimistic in the talent that he can be. And again, like I told you with the breakdown from One Punch Power in terms of assessing whether or not a fighter has that, you can't even, you have to give them the benefit of the doubt when they demonstrate they can do it. You can't just look at an opponent, unless in very special circumstances where you like go down a regional record and you see, oh yeah, he knocked a guy out with one punch, but it's the only one on his record, and it came against a guy that was like 2-10 for his career and had been knocked out 5 times and was like 40 years old. Then you're like, okay, that's a little bit of a setup spot. But Sergey, I don't know how many times he had been knocked out prior to that. He had been knocked out once. I think it was Anshul Jubli, and that was in the second round. So he had never been put out with one punch like that early in a fight prior in his career. So it's not like the guy was super chinny or anything. And if memory serves, Jubli, that was like a ground and pound TKO, I think. That wasn't like a one punch lights out ordeal or anything. So that was just him getting dominated by a fighter that was better, more well-rounded than him. But the U one, I mean, he was just more measured, against a defensively irresponsible opponent and caught him clean. There's that same kind of, not to the same extent of making him bad, obviously, because Santos is, for better or worse, the guy has clearly shown to be worthy of being in the UFC. The question is, we're going to learn how good Yu is from this fight, because if he is as advertised, he should be able to take advantage of an opponent like Santos that is reckless and defensively irresponsible, but very, very willing to pressure, like is relentless in terms of the pressure that he's putting out. Kind of similar to Jiří Procházka in that sense, who we'll talk about further up in this card. But even Procházka, I don't think, has a negative differential on strikes the way that Santos does for his UFC career. I mean, again, you go back to that Castaneda fight. Castaneda was having a lot of success early, had him hurt multiple times, but Santos was able to just, and again, I hate using this kind of colloquialism, but he was able to dog it out. I mean, he was able to get his wits back about him, never went out all the way, got knocked down, but never like an egregiously bad knockdown, lost the first round, but was able to gain his wits back about him, not mentally check out of the fight and come back and get a finish. But still, when you start leveling up in terms of the talent you're facing, you wonder when someone is going to be able to take advantage of that, particularly if they have the kind of power that you demonstrated in his last fight. So this one is graded so close for me. I mean, if I had more time to look at, if I had better data on you, I might have a much better, different read on it and might even favor Santos a little bit. But on a card where I'm already kind of lacking in terms of underdogs, I mean, we're getting an undefeated fighter that is coming off of a sensational performance. I mean, most guys, when they have a knockout like that, they end up front running, and we're getting him a plus money here. And I'm getting the opportunity to fade another guy that I've gotten unlucky with on reads previously. I think this could be a good spot. So I'm going to take you. I know Santos has never been finished, but I'm going to say that you gets him out in the first round, that we see Santos, that recklessness comes back to haunt him again. You is just too measured. And where Castaneda, I think, does have good power, but has, I don't know how many, he's never had a knockout like the one that you had against Sergey. I think that we see you shows that he's, chosen by the Korean Zombie for a reason. So I'm going to go with you. Give me you by first round knockout. But again, at plus money just on the money line, I think it's just good enough to back him as a straight up underdog and ride with whatever the outcome ends up being. It'll be interesting to see what happens if this fight goes late. Again, Yu's undefeated. He does have 4 decisions on his resume. I think only one of those was a 2-round decision. So he's gone the distance 3 times previously. Again, there's a lot of people, I think, I don't know about a lot of people. I've heard some people say that, and this just kind of comes with when you're coming out of Asia, whatever to begin with, competition isn't as high as it might be elsewhere. And I know Santos is a shoot box guy, so he's obviously going to be well trained coming into this. It's a tough fight to call, but I usually feel good about being on the plus side in these fights that are going to be close anyway. I was in another similar case last week with Tom Nolan and Charlie Campbell, where it was very close line, basically identically lined to this fight, but was a pick'em at one point. Not only similar line, but similar line movement in terms of it basically being a pick'em before the guy that ultimately won the fight, though closed as the favorite, but only slightly so, like in the minus 140 range, which is the same place that Santos is now. But I backed the underdog on the basis that I thought they were going to have more knockout upside. And I kind of have a similar thing here, even though I've got it graded razor close. I still feel good about being on the side with the plus money. Campbell got the early knockdown, even though it didn't get scored as one, but we all saw Nolan get dropped. and he started the fight well, but just kind of let it get away from him. I think that there's a similar sort of read here in terms of I feel good being on in a fight that I have graded very close. I'm going to take the plus money on the guy that I think has better finishing upside than his opponent does. So give me Ju Sang Yu to win by first round knockout. The next fight is Farid Basharat and Chris Gutierrez. Basharat's 13-0, hasn't fought since October of last year at UFC 308, where he beat Victor Hugo by unanimous decision. Conversely, Chris Gutierrez is 22-6-2. Last fought at Fight Night Machado Gary versus Prates back at the end of April, where he beat John Castaneda by split decision in a fight that I believe was supposed to happen at UFC 314, if not 13, but had to get rebooked. I'm not going to spend very long on this one because I've already said that I'm staying off it. And I spent way too much time on the first stay away on this card. I don't want to spend a lot of time on this one. When you think about this fight purely in terms of charting how you think it's going to go, it's very easy to see why people are putting out Basharat at 450. Much more well-rounded than Gutierrez is. If he gets the takedowns, which he probably will, even though Gutierrez has above average takedown defense, if the fight hits the floor, Basharat is probably banking the round because Gutierrez, whether it's him going to the ground because he's hurt or just getting taken down generally, he's going to do the guard goblin routine, similar to what I explained Muniz did after he got kicked in the private parts against Daniel Santos. He will just lock up the triangle from his guard. Well, it sounds wrong, but not a triangle, but he will just play guard and won't really do anything from his back, and is content to just wait out the round there, thinking, okay, yeah, I can give away the round, but then I can get back up and the fight will start on the feet and I'll win the other two. Even if he ends up dropping multiple rounds that way, we'll think that he can just do that to end up getting the finish. Nah, that sounds harsh. I love Gutierrez. I picked him as an underdog when he hit the spinning back fist knockout on Batgirl Dana and at UFC Columbus, which is the most successful event of my entire, not only MMA, but betting lifetime. So he's always going to have a fond place in my memories for that. And the guy is just, I've spoken about before. Best hip feints in the UFC. Guy's obviously a deadly, deadly leg kicker. I think he's a better fighter than what he's shown in his last three performances. Got blown out against Song Yadong in his first and probably only main event. Had a letdown performance against Kang Bang Lee, in which it was a short notice fight. I try to give fighters some grace when they take opponents on short notice that they haven't had a lot of time to prepare for. But I think most people would agree that fight was 1-1 going into the third when Gutierrez was a heavy favorite. And he gave away the second round largely by doing what I just described in terms of getting taken down and not making much of an effort to get up, writing it out from guard, giving the round away, feeling good that he could win the last round if he kept it upright standing and get a 29-28, which is exactly what he did. And then got the win against John Castaneda, which I thought he deserved. I figured it was going to be close. It didn't surprise me. It was a split, but I felt pretty good about him getting the win over Castaneda regardless, even though I had that fight graded pretty close. But I like Gutierrez a lot. I know what his strengths and his weaknesses are and what his tendency is, and it's a terrible stylistic pairing for what Basharat is capable of. So I think Basharat could potentially even not put this on the ground and still fight a close fight. But given how well-rounded he is, he's probably going to use his striking to set up his takedowns. And then once he gets his takedowns, the fight is basically over. I think that the decision or the over 2.5 rounds on this was like minus 350, something insane. Yeah, it was minus 350, and I think now it's like it was minus 270, now it's minus 300. I feel like that's still pretty good, but I already have enough like money lines that are in the mid to high 200s on this fight that I don't want to spend time stressing over an over here, even though I feel pretty good about both guys dragging this out to decision given the kind of fighters they are and the lack of knockout upside here. So just stay away from this one. I don't blame anybody for betting Basharat just because it seems like a foregone conclusion of how this is going to go if it goes to the ground. But if it doesn't go to the ground for some reason, this one could get interesting. So I'm going to be rooting for Gutierrez, but I'm going to be doing it pretty much while knowing that if this goes how everybody thinks it's going to go, it's probably going to be one-way traffic, which sucks because, again, I like Gutierrez a lot. More than Basharat, honestly. Either of the Basharats. But Farid, for better or worse, the guy's pretty good. I don't know what his future is in a division as crowded as bantamweight is, but he ain't no slouch, and he's well-rounded enough to take advantage of what Gutierrez has already proven he doesn't really want to deal with. So give me Basharat to win 30-27, but even as confident as I am picking a 30-27 in his favor, I still see where Gutierrez could win this if the fight stays standing. Because if it does, and he's getting his leg kicks off, it could be more interesting than I think the people that are just throwing money at Basharat want to believe here. That being said, I still think Basharat gets it done. The featured prelim at UFC 320 is Edmen Shahbazyan and Andre Muniz. Shahbazyan is 15-5, last fought at Fight Night Usman versus Buckley, so UFC Atlanta, back in the middle of June, in which Shahbazyan got what I consider to be the most impressive win of his UFC career. That's right, I said it. The most impressive win of his UFC career. Him knocking out Brad Tavares was impressive, but you know what? Him going the distance after having no unanimous decision wins previously in his entire MMA career and getting a 30-27 again. I think one judge might have scored at 29-28. But two judges, I believe, got it 30-27. Granted, he didn't have to deal with the wrestling of Petrosky the whole time. But part of that was a credit to him keeping the fight measured and standing for 15 minutes. And I think he did almost get a finish late, in fact. But got a unanimous decision win. And I think that's very encouraging for his overall outlook in the UFC, given that he's only 27 years old. Conversely, Andre Muniz last fought at Fight Night Machado Gary versus Pratis, where he got knocked out in the final seconds of the first round against Ikram Alaskarov. I had the under at I don't think it was quite plus money, but it was like minus 105, so close to pick'em range, still technically a dog pick. But yeah, I was kind of surprised that given how heavily favored Alaskarov was and the attrition Muniz had suffered and having not fought for a year and a half, basically, that people weren't expecting he was going to get finished. And then the way that he got finished was pretty concerning. Had a bit of a not quite a super delayed reaction in the same way that like Shane Burgos had when he fought Edson Barbosa, but still one that was kind of like, I'll stop short of saying stunning, but still kind of was surprising that like, oh wow, like that was weird, like in terms of him having a delayed reaction and eventually getting finished against the fence from like the fetal position or whatever to Alaskarov. So that was the 6th time he's been knocked out in his MMA career. If you go back and you one of the knockouts that he suffered when he fought, here's a crazy name for you. He fought Azamat Murzakanov in 2016. And if you go watch that knockout, it's bizarre. Like he not only gets put out in the first minute, but he's like out like a light. And it feels a little bit like setup-y, like a little bit like, I don't want to say floppish, but it does have a little bit of a suspicious twang to it. It was in a weird promotion, International Caucasian Fight Championship, Tech Crep FC. Crep is spelled Krep. I don't believe I've heard of that one before or since. Obviously, Murzakanov is still undefeated at this point and has gone on to potentially put himself in the contender position at 205. But yeah, weird. It was a bit of a weird result there, but one that made me pretty concerned about his damage tolerance, regardless of the fact that he had been knocked out previously in his MMA career 3 times, even prior to the UFC. Now he's been knocked out 2 times in his last 3 fights. And one of the guys that did that was Paul Craig. And Paul Craig just retired. And the other thing about that Paul Craig fight was Muniz, I think, was doing well early, but gassed. And that gassing out let Paul Craig come back and make people think that, oh, maybe this guy could do something interesting at 185, as opposed to Muniz just being kind of washed. He got a robbery against Junyoung Park. That fight cost... I had a very good 2023, but it could have been even better if I had gotten the nod on that decision there. That was a robbery that felt like a kick in the privates towards the end of the year, unfortunately. But it is what it is. But that being said, I mean, he gassed out in that fight too, and for the first 2 rounds of it, he, for a lot of it, got exactly the fight that he would have wanted in terms of it being on the ground from a grappling perspective. So I don't think he has the gas tank at this point to support the style of fight that he wants for 15 minutes, and that's not even taking into account him getting damaged early against strikers that are better and more powerful than he is. So, I mean, you saw against Alaskarov, he was able to take advantage of that very quickly, and that was off of a very long layoff. He's coming off of another pretty considerable layoff here, but Shahbazyan has only fought 2 months more recently than he has, so ring rust isn't really going to come into play here the way that I thought it was going to when he fought Alaskarov. That being said, the guy should debatably be on a 4-fight losing streak. In my opinion, he pretty much is. Not really a lot of standout wins for him in his MMA career. Or not MMA career, but his UFC career prior to that, given the stage of careers that a lot of these guys were at. Everybody points to the Jakari Souza arm breaking, which was super brutal, but Souza was at the end of his career at that point. Muniz is also one of these guys that a lot of people, like, you look at his like Tapology profile or whatever, and he looks like jacked from before in the early stages of his UFC career, and it looks like he either had to stop roiding at the risk of being caught or something, and it just hasn't, it's something that happens with a lot of Brazilian fighters. But just hasn't shown up looking as physically impressive as he used to in his recent appearances. And that post-dump has kind of manifested itself in this losing 3 of his last 4 in the twilight of his career. And he's 35 years old now, facing a guy in Shahbazyan who's 8 years younger at this point. Clearly the more impressive striker. The thing with Shahbazyan has just been, does he have more than 5 minutes of gas? And what happens if this fight goes late? Even if this fight goes late, I don't know if Muniz is going to be able to capitalize. I hope this fight doesn't go late, because it's going to be an absolute slop fest if this thing hits the 3rd round. That being said, the guy that has looked more impressive in the third round of late is undoubtedly Shahbazyan based on the performance he just had. Petroski gets criticized for his cardio too, but the reality is prior to that fight, the guy had never lost a decision. So a guy that had never won by unanimous decision won by unanimous decision against a guy that had never lost going the distance, period. It was a very, very impressive result that greatly improved my estimation of his overall career outlook in the UFC. And I'm saying that as somebody that bet on Petroski, largely convinced that the cardio was going to play a big factor, in the same way that I did when I picked Gerald Meerschaert as a plus 250 underdog to beat Shahbazyan last year. I feel very good about the trajectory Shahbazyan's on now. This is a great matchup for him to keep building him up through 185. I would imagine that Muniz is probably going to get cut after this, unless most fighters get cut after 3 losses in a row. So maybe he's got one more fight in him, depending on how quickly he gets booked after this. I'm sure there's some middleweights they probably like to throw him at. I know Cam Rouston just won last weekend. That would be, an interesting guy at 185 to throw him at. But I feel pretty good about where Shahbazyan is at going forward based on the last result. I'm going to say he gets a first-round knockout here. Second-round finish wouldn't surprise me. I don't really see where Muniz is going to be able to be successful here, because it's not like Shahbazyan has bad takedown defense. It's a little bit above average. But even if he has early success in the grappling in this fight, I don't think he has the gas tank to sustain his optimal fight style at this point. So he's either going to get finished early, or he's going to have early success, get tired, and open a window for Shahbazyan to come back and finish him late. And God help us all if this fight goes the distance, because that third round is going to be horrendous. Especially if they end up... The worst case scenario is Muniz has early success, wins the first round. Shahbazyan starts to come back but doesn't finish him in the second round. And then both guys are exhausted going into the third, and we're in a position where the third round is impossible to score and this ends up being a split. But even though I think that that's not out of the question, every other way I see this fight going is in Shahbazyan's favor, short of Muniz getting a first round submission, which I just don't see happening for him at this point. So give me Shahbazyan to win by first round knockout, but I could see a late finish too. I don't really see Muniz getting it done here other than winning the first round and then winning the third round, because both guys are totally exhausted. I even think that if he does win the first round, I think it's more likely that Shahbazyan comes back and finishes the fight than it is Muniz survives the second round and wins the third on the sheer merit of both guys just being too exhausted to do anything to each other. So feel great about Shahbazyan here. He's minus 275. When I put the pick out, now he's dropping down to minus 310. That's a bit more than where I would want to play him at based on the grade. But again, based on everything I just said, I'm pretty convinced that he's going to get it done here and get it done in really impressive fashion. So, Edmen Shahbazyan, round 1 knockout. The first fight on the main card at UFC 320 is Joe Pyfer and Abus Magomedov. Pyfer is 14-3, last fought at UFC 316, where he was rebooked to fight Kelvin Gastelum after supposed to having fought him at UFC Mexico City earlier this year. I was prepared to pick Gastelum at Mexico City Elevation. Pyfer kind of recognized, I think, that he talked a lot of junk about Mexico as a country after he pulled out, and I think that only further reflected the fact that Gastelum was probably going to beat him there, but got the fight rebooked for 316. Won a 29-28 decision in which he kind of I can't remember if one or two judges scored it 29-28, but most people recognized that Gastelum had a better third round than the first two. I personally thought Gastelum had a pretty good argument for winning that fight, but nobody really saw it the way that I did, which I'm at peace with. But I was a little bit biased having picked Gastelum originally. Rebooking, I said stay away. Now that the elevation's out of the equation, I don't really see Gastelum winning, and the pricing was, I think, similar if not worse to when they were supposed to fight in Mexico City. But Pyfer ends up going the distance. I do think two judges scored it 29-28 for Pyfer, so they thought that he lost the third round. Looking at the numbers for this again, so it's very hard to trust Pyfer's gas tank in later rounds. Which was something that was evident after the Hermansson fight, but if you were just theorizing that going into the Gastelum fight, it was kind of proven, especially given the fact that he won the first 10 minutes convincingly in the eyes of most people, not in mine, but in the judges, they both saw it well enough for him that they were willing to give him the first 2 rounds. Abus Magomedov is 28-6-1 and last competed at Fight Night Machado Gary versus Prates, where he got a unanimous decision over Michel Pereira in what many people would say was one of the worst fights of the year. And both guys did not look impressive, but Pereira not only didn't look impressive, but hardly threw anything in that fight, to the point that and was seen shortly after that fight on a yacht. And even though there's a lot of people that say that guy has made a fortune in cryptocurrency, it led a lot of people to be skeptical about the circumstances of what happened after that fight, given the fact that he not only had a bad performance, but hardly did anything to win it. I, of course, was very confident Pereira was going to win based on previous stuff that had happened to that fight, and not really being a big believer in Magomedov and having faded Magomedov pretty regularly. So it was, I think I made him a leg that night, and I had a lot of good reads on that card, but the big area I screwed up at was thinking Ian Gary was going to beat Prates, and Gary being valued at the same price that Pereira was, and opting to go with what I thought was the safer option in Pereira over Gary, given the fact that I respected Prates more as an opponent for Gary than I did Magomedov as an opponent for Pereira. That was kind of correct at the same time, because Magomedov, again, didn't have an impressive performance, but my faith was misplaced in terms of which was the correct fighter to back without question. I'm going to keep this one brief, because I think at this point we know who Joe Pyfer is. He's an extremely, he's a powerful, menacing force for the first 10 minutes. And then he's basically got nothing after that. That means that he's going to be a good main card fighter for however long his UFC career is. But it also means that he's not going to be someone that is going to be a realistic title contender, or somebody that the UFC can feel good about putting in a main event or just a 5-round fight, period. But if they want to keep putting him in these 3-round fights against, guys that have some divisional relevance, he's going to be able to not only win a lot of those fights, but make them entertaining. And so I think that's why the UFC has taken a liking to him. Not just the fact that Dana has obviously invested a lot of money into this guy in terms of paying for his apartment in the infancy of his UFC run and whatever. So there's clearly promotional push around this guy. I know he did the docu-series or documentary biography, whatever, with Daily Wire, which I haven't seen. I have no plan on seeing that. I have a pretty good idea of what Pyfer's story is at this point, and it's it's always cool to see people that overcome that adversity to, kind of make this rise through stardom. But at the same time, I also recognize that he's gotten a lot of selective matchmaking thanks to being a darling of Dana and someone that Dana put a lot of faith in early on. And it feels like that he's going to be protected moving forward because of that. And I imagine that it's going to be a long time before he gets another main event for the reasons I just outlined. He's gotten another very graceful matchmaking occurrence here in the sense that Magomedov is somebody that has some name relevance, but is 6 years older than he is, coming off of a horrible performance despite it being a win. And the guy has had a suspect gas tank for a lot of his time in the UFC. And because of that, you feel pretty good that even though I feel like this is a fight that if it goes the distance, and I kind of expect it to, even if this is a fight that comes down to the second round, you still feel pretty good about Pyfer banking that based on the fact that Magomedov, if he does get hurt in the first round, which I expect him to, isn't going to have enough there to make enough of an impression that outweighs whatever damage Pyfer is able to land in the next 5 minutes after the opening 5. So I expect this one to go very similarly to how Pyfer's other recent performances that have gone the distance do. He wins the first 10 minutes. He kind of takes his foot off the gas, whether he's tired or having trouble figuring out what adjustments to make, and loses steam in the last 5. And Abus, I guess, just on sheer activity, is able to take the final 5 minutes. But Pyfer clearly wins a 29-28, where he doesn't really make a big impression, positive impression on the pay-per-view audience, but does enough to get a win and keep advancing to the next stage, whatever that is. Again, I think at this point, he's going to be someone that will be an entertaining fighter for main cards of pay-per-view events. I just don't see him ever really becoming a contender in a, I don't know about deep, but certainly top-heavy division where you've got several fighters that have proven they're much more capable of handling themselves in 5-round fights than what we've seen from Pyfer. Think about what a guy like Fluffy Hernandez would do to Pyfer. I even think Brendan Allen might be a bit of a difficult man. Brendan Allen's got his own kind of gas tank issues, I guess. But I think there's a lot of fighters that have proven to be better 5-round opponents. Like even think about like Jared Cannonier, I think might even be, I don't know about favored against Pyfer, but I know that my analysis would tell me that Pyfer would probably be the guy to bet over Cannonier if they were to fight. But my gut is telling me that Cannonier wins that fight, especially after what happened against RoboCop. Could be the same exact thing where Cannonier gets a drop twice within the opening 10 minutes, but by the start of round 4, all of the momentum has already swung back in his favor. It's going to take Pyfer a long time to correct what happened in the Hermansson fight to where people, I think, take him seriously as a title contender. And I don't know how quickly that's going to get resolved. But that's not going to be a problem here, I don't think. Give me Pyfer to win 29-28, clearly win the first 10 minutes, take his gas off for the last round, and Magomedov has hung around enough at that point where he's just kind of peppering him with kicks from range to where on sheer activity he takes the last round, but never puts Pyfer in a position where he's in danger of getting finished and so isn't able to get a 10-8 or a late finish to where he swings the fight back into even potential draw territory. So Pyfer by decision. The next fight is Youssef Zalal and Josh Emmett. Zalal enters 17-5-1, last fought at Fight Night Cannonier Rodriguez back in February of this year, where he took a unanimous decision win over Qatar, dominated the first 10 minutes, took his foot off the gas the last 5. Qatar tried to battle himself back into it, but the crazy thing is, for how people remember that fight and being like violently angry at Zalal for not trying to get a finish and just kind of coasting to a win, he still, despite the fact that he was running away the whole time in an apex cage, was still able to skirt the cage enough and actually outstruck Qatar, I think, by one significant strike, even though the fight clearly on body language in terms of Qatar being the one advancing, Qatar ended up taking that round. Zalal was so much further ahead over the first 10 minutes that it didn't even matter. Now, here's the thing. If you're betting on guys, you want your fighter to do the smart thing. And he did do the smart thing there. I liken it to what happened with Jamie Malarkey against Ronaldo Bedoya last week, where Malarkey clearly won the first 10 minutes, but did not think he was going to have enough left to get a finish in the third round. So he said, okay, all I'm going to do is I'm not going to put where I think the younger version of Malarkey might have been a bit more reckless and potentially gotten finished. Malarkey recognized, I got the first 2 rounds banked. All I need to do is not take any super compromising shots and I get a win. So he absorbed some, punches and sequences from Bedoya, but did a good job keeping him honest with his own striking. And whenever the opportunity presented itself to shoot a takedown or initiate a clinch or put the fight on the fence and just drain the clock, he did that without ever taking a shot that potentially would have put the fight in, or the round in 10-8 territory and risked a draw. As a fan, probably drives you crazy, especially if you bet Bedoya. If you bet Malarkey, I remember watching that fight thinking, Malarkey, I'm so happy for you that you elected to do this the right way. Maybe you didn't make yourself any new fans, but you were already fighting in Australia, so what does it matter? You were in front of your home country, you needed a win, and you got one, and you did it because you clearly won the first 2 rounds, and you put yourself in the best position to secure the win by not taking anything that would have ruined the work that you did in the first 2 with something stupid in the third round. I was so happy for him as somebody that backed him. So, yeah, you can, as a fan, you're probably furious at how Zalal ended the fight against Qatar. But as a bettor, you want your side to always elect to fight the smartest path to victory. And because I trust Zalal to do that here, based on his most recent performance, I don't see why the last fight he had would go any differently than this one based on what his opponent presents. Emmett is nuclear option or bust at this point. For all the enthusiasm fans still have around him because of the Bryce Mitchell knockout, the guy is quietly he's got 3 losses in his last 4 fights. And many people would argue he got a robbery in the Qatar fight. Most people think it's because the 4th round of that fight was incorrectly scored by Chris Lee, if memory serves. And then they had a whole debacle where the next week they screwed up the Sarukian-Gamro decision because they didn't acknowledge the knockdown that Sarukian got with the spinning back fist. And that was another fight Chris Lee scored. So it was back-to-back fights where a championship round of a main event got incorrectly scored and ended up costing what should have been the correct winner. But yeah, most people thought Qatar won that fight. If he did win that fight, as many people thought he did, then this is a guy in Emmett who has lost 4 of his last 5 since 2022. But he ends up getting the title shot off of that against Yair Rodriguez for the interim, or I don't know if it was interim, but it was a vacant belt. And was doing well early. Yair claims that he got hit so hard he doesn't remember going on autopilot and just kind of wilding out and somehow getting a submission. Based on how Yair's career has gone since then, I don't really know how much I can buy into that. That being said, still got the result done. Does the younger version of Emmett allow that fight to get away from him after hurting Yair that badly? Who knows? But Emmett is 40 and is basically nuclear option or bust at this point. And he's fighting a guy in Zalal who is going to, he doesn't have a reach advantage. So again, I've talked before about how the guy, like the height is going to be a liability for Zalal here. At the same time, we just saw how much Emmett struggled with a fighter that moves very well laterally in his fight with Lerone Murphy. And we're now in a very similar position here with Youssef Zalal in terms of a fighter that moves very well laterally and demonstrated that lateral movement in striking in a much smaller octagon last time out in the Apex. Now they're going to T-Mobile, they're getting the full-size one, and so he's going to have an easier time getting around the cage than he did in a tighter environment that would have been more conducive to throwing the kind of close boxing range, not like knockout with your fist area that Emmett is going to need to keep this fight in. I just don't see Zalal giving him that option. And if this fight goes to the ground, Zalal has already proven to be a brilliant grappler and much more of a submission threat than Emmett has ever been in the UFC. So the one thing that does concern me a little bit is Emmett has proven to be much better going the distance. So if Zalal does end up getting knocked down in one of the early rounds but not put out all the way and he gives up the first, I'm not going to feel good about him winning the last 10 minutes, or, you know, if he wins the first, gets knocked down in the second, I'm not going to feel good about him winning the third just because he's shown he's used to coasting. But I don't really see this one going any other way other than Zalal's direction. Over 10 years younger, proven to be the much more sprightly guy on the feet, much more defensively responsible than Emmett is, never been finished, has considerably less career attrition at this point, much more well-rounded. If the fight does go to the ground, I think it's his fight to lose at that point. The only thing that concerns me is if he does end up dropping one of the first two rounds somehow, he's not going to be in a position, I think, to win by decision, because that third round is probably going to go to Emmett, regardless of how well he's done over the first two. But I think he's in... I just don't see him losing the first two rounds. I don't see Emmett getting exactly the fight that he would need, the way that somebody like Bryce Mitchell, who is, you know, a ground fighting savant, but otherwise a dumbass in pretty much every area of his life. Mitchell gave Emmett exactly what he needed to win that fight. If he did not do that, a person with a normal brain and the same skills as Bryce Mitchell, if between that and correct judging in the Qatar fight, we're talking about a guy in Emmett that's on a 5-fight losing streak. I totally get why the market's at where it's at. It was minus 455 when I put out the pick, and then literally like within moments of me doing that, I'm not saying there's a correlation. It was just funny coincidence for me looking at the line. It's like, oh, of course, the guy's 500 now. And I wouldn't play him at 500, even if on a implied probability basis, the difference between 400 and 500 range isn't that great. In terms of what you have to wager to actually get value on it, 500 probably isn't worth it. So this is probably going in the moonshot at this point, unless it dips back down into 400, which I kind of hope it does. But I think Zalal very easily wins a 29-28 decision here. And who knows? I mean, given that Qatar was able to get the third round just on the basis of advancing and basically equaling Zalal out in volume, Emmett might not even land enough based on the fact that he's looking for the kill shot, that if Zalal still clearly outstrikes him moving backwards the whole last round, Zalal still might end up getting it 30-27, but I expect him to kind of disengage enough after banking the first two that he's just going to do whatever he can to not get hit and not take damage. So Give me Zalal to win 29-28. 30-27 wouldn't surprise me. Be nice to see him go for a submission if this goes to the ground, but I don't see why, based on what he elected to do against Qatar, where he had a very obvious grappling advantage in that fight too, I don't see why he would do anything else here. So give me Zalal to win, and it'll be interesting to see where he goes from here at 29 years old. I know there's a lot of enthusiasm around him. Factory X is a gym I respect a lot, and they've been singing his praises for a while. I think he's got a bright future in this division. It would be very interesting to see how he does in a 5-round event as well. I would like to see that. I don't want him to fight Steve Garcia, though. I'm a little worried he would beat Garcia, and I want to see great things for my guy Steve. But we'll see where he goes from here, and we'll see what happens with Emmett. Emmett, 40 years old, maybe he hangs it up after this, after a loss here I think would pretty firmly put him out of the title picture, probably drop him out of the top 10 if he's still hanging around there. But who knows? Maybe he wants to go out on a win, but we'll see what happens with Emmett. In any event, give me Zalal 29-28. The featured bout at UFC 320 is Jiří Procházka and Khalil Roundtree Jr. Procházka is 31-5-1. Last fought at UFC 311, the first pay-per-view this year, where he had a thrilling fight with Jamal Hill in which he knocked Hill down in the first round. Hill came back in the second round, and then they were both getting their shots in the third round before Jiří hurt him pretty considerably and was able to get an attrition finish in the middle of the third round. I had Hill that night. I hadn't given up hope in Hill. I hadn't given up hope in Hill either when he fought Khalil Roundtree at UFC Azerbaijan, which was pretty easily my worst event this year up until UFC Noche and what was the other one right before that? UFC Paris. Both of those did not go so well for me. But neither did Azerbaijan, where after, what was it? I picked Bahamondes to beat Fiziev in the co-main, and after pretty much everything had gone awry for me on that event, I said, just go ahead and play Roundtree at this point in my recap of the Bahamondes Fiziev fight. And if you did, congrats, you made money, because Hill looked completely washed against Roundtree. Roundtree won a fairly easy 50-45 going away. So yeah, you could argue Roundtree's performance against Hill was more impressive, but I also think we got a more inspired version of Hill against Procházka than the one we got when he fought Roundtree. So this is the fight that I'm most looking forward to on the card, way more than either of the two title fights. Because I like both of these guys. I like Roundtree less, I think, as a fighter, just because there's not a lot of well-roundedness there, and for a guy that is as physically impressive as Roundtree is, you would want him to make more of that than he usually does. And there's so many impressive, nasty, violent KOs that he has early in his career that have just not translated into the kind of fighter that he's become in this surprise title contention stage. You compare that to Jiří. I mean, look, this is the first fight that I've ever picked Jiří outright in since I started doing this. But as a fan, I don't know how you can dislike this guy. The things that, and even taking the fan element out of it, one of the the thing that I most admire about this sport and why it's become my favorite other than American football is it's violent chess. There's in theory, on paper, there is whatever a guy is effective at, there is a way to mitigate or counter or take it away from them that you can implement. And if you just come in with the right game plan, if you've worked on developing the full tools and skills that are available to you within the rule set in the sport, you can put yourself in a position to win or at least make any fight close just by knowing what your opponent's strengths are and how to mitigate them, and just knowing the correct way to react in basically any given situation. But the guys that are the most entertaining people in this sport are the ones that go beyond the conventional ways of resolving issues or finding their way to victory. The guys that are unorthodox. Guys like Dominic Cruz that develop their own style in terms of, not fighting southpaw or orthodox, but squaring their feet up and moving in a kind of figure eight pattern that nobody else does. I think the best example is guys that, fight guard down, but have done it in a way where they're so good at managing distance that they're always super defensively responsible and become impossible to read or hit, despite the fact that they're not even really defending their head the way that you're taught to. Michael Venom Page is exactly who that is, and it's why so many people have gravitated to that style. There's guys like, I know he just is coming off a letdown performance where he didn't grapple, but someone like Chase Hooper, who I think I've said and I still maintain is the most creative scrambler in the UFC, just doing all these sorts of weird rolls and counters and floating on top of his opponents in ways that you don't see from anybody else. The people that are fighting in the ways that are not conventional are the ones that are typically the most entertaining to observe. And that's exactly what Jiří is. Jiří is the definition of unorthodox. And the guy is, he's a menace. He's just a menace. It's one thing to be unorthodox. It's another thing to be unorthodox with a relentless come forward approach. And that's really what people want to see, is not the guys that, I just got done talking about Zalal fighting the right way. Those are the guys you typically want to bet on because they're going to do the responsible thing. Fans want to see the irresponsible at the promise of maybe getting a finish, which is exactly what Jiří delivers. The guy's not going to stop pressuring. He's not going to come forward regardless of how much he gets hit. You got to put him out if you want to put him away. If you don't, doesn't matter if he's not checking your leg kicks and how beat up his leg is going to get. He's just going to press forward. You got to turn off his lights the way that Pereira did. And that's why Pereira is the only guy that's been able to beat him in the UFC, the only guy that's been able to beat him in almost the last 10 years. So I look at this and I think, okay, Jiří's the favorite. He's probably not more of a favorite because Roundtree had arguably a more impressive performance than Hill did, against Hill than Jiří did, where he didn't give away a single round the way that Jiří did. But at the same time, I think it's important to remember the circumstances to where Roundtree got into this title contention position. Roundtree used to be a guy that was impressive Muay Thai striker, but not well-rounded, and was able to be exploited by guys that had more well-rounded skill sets like Ion Cutelaba. It's important to remember that the last guy that he lost to before the title fight with Pereira was Marcin Prachnio, and Prachnio was never anything more than a low leg kick cheeser, and still beat him by decision purely on that basis. Beats Modestas Bukauskas before Bukauskas goes through the career metamorphosis, and granted, that was like the last time Roundtree had like a really... I think that was the oblique kick that people like to reference a lot, where people are like, that's one of the most sickening knockouts I've seen that wasn't to somebody's head. Carl Roberson, the guy washed out of the UFC pretty quickly. I would argue that's probably the least impressive victory out of all of these in his last 4 or 5 years. Dustin Jacoby, most people would tell you Jacoby won that fight, including me, who picked Jacoby to win. Roundtree only got that fight on the basis of two big moments of damage where he was otherwise completely outpointed by Jacoby. That's a fight that I go back to a lot in terms of when they talk about making the switch from score, like valuing damage over just pure striking activity. Roundtree had two big moments of damage and won a split decision based on that. And most people think it was the wrong one, even after that re-emphasis. But it's important to remember that they made that change shortly before that fight happened, which is why I think people had such a visceral reaction to what the outcome actually was. Daukaus, that was a great night for me because I not only picked Roundtree to win, I picked him to the under 1.5, which was the same price as his money line, which I thought was outrageous. Both of them were around like minus 175. That was easy money that night at Luque dos Santos. Anthony Smith, I took the over thinking Smith was going to survive, and that was a plus money, and that ended up cashing. I was still a little bit worried about it, but he ended up going into the third round, and then Smith turtled over, and that was that. And then got suspended for a self-reported drug violation. Despite that, was shortly after suspension granted the short notice replacement title shot for fighting Pereira at Salt Lake, and nearly has the performance of his life. I mean, clearly won the opening 2 rounds, but didn't put Pereira away. And then Pereira came back in a way where he took the fight to Roundtree in a way where Roundtree just was not able to tolerate the pressure that was coming back his way, and ended up getting finished in the 4th round. Now, if that's a 3-round fight, how different is it? I mean, maybe if it's a 3-round fight, Pereira feels more urgency to make a better impression in the 2nd round than he did in that case, where he knew he had 5 rounds, had the experience of being a champion, preparing for 5-round fights, and recognized that even though he had probably dropped the first 2 rounds, certainly the 2nd round, but potentially also the 1st, and he did drop the 1st, that he was going to be able to come back and win the 3rd on the merit of having better cardio and being able to put the fight where he wanted, which is exactly what happened. And then the Hill fight happens. Again, I think Hill was a worse version of the one that came back to fight Jiří, and having suffered that attrition and further attrition in the Jiří fight, was just not in a comfortable position fighting in Azerbaijan. Roundtree at that point hadn't competed since losing to Pereira, so had enough time to recuperate and recover. I know his nose is permanently disfigured or something from that fight, but still, had his best performance. But also, I mean, Hill just looked like he didn't have a clue in that one. Was never really able to make any adjustments to where Roundtree was ever really threatened in that fight. I could see Jiří doing something similar to what Pereira did in terms of, even if Roundtree has a lot of early success and maybe wins the 1st round with a knockdown or something, I don't see Jiří going away. And Jiří is way more of a well-rounded threat than what Roundtree has had to deal with lately. I mean, I just went through his recent career history. The last time that he really had to worry about a credible wrestling threat in one of his fights was against Cutelaba, who finished him in the 1st round. Jamal Hill wasn't taking him down. Pereira wasn't taking him down. Anthony Smith wasn't taking him down. Chris Daukaus was never taking him down. Justin Jacoby was not taking him down. Roberson was probably one of the biggest takedown threat out of that bunch I just mentioned, but he's also easily the worst fighter out of the ones that I just listed out to you. Bukauskas had no interest in taking him down at that stage of his career either. And I told you, Pragnio's a low leg kick cheeser. He wasn't going to take him down either. That's 8 opponents. So this is fight number 9 out of the recent ones. And this guy that is averaging just barely over half a takedown per 15 minutes in his UFC career is still the most credible threat in the wrestling and grappling department that he's had to face out of all of those guys. easily. I mean, look, it's not like Jiří's gone out of his way to steer fights in that department during his time. He'd obviously rather give an entertaining performance on the feet, but he's also the only fighter that's ever submitted Glover Teixeira. And granted, I had Jiří graded to win that fight, but I didn't feel super confident in it given the run Glover was on, so I hedged on the over, and that was the way better bet. That ended up cashing very easily. Jiří kind of bailed himself out with, getting the submission at the end, but there's still something to be said about being the only guy to have submitted a former UFC champion and a guy that made his bread and butter on fighting on the ground for the entirety of his UFC career. So I think that the path for Jiří to dominate this fight on the ground is there if he elects to take it, and he can take it there. Roundtree's takedown defense is like dead average for his entire UFC career, and it has not been tested for like 4 or 5 years at this point. So if he opts to be the guy that pushes Roundtree into that realm, I think he can take advantage pretty considerably. It's just a matter of, does he end up doing that or not? Even if he doesn't, he's going to have the reach advantage, and he's going to be able to pressure him unconventionally in the same way that Pereira did, to where Roundtree did not like doing that at all. Roundtree wants to keep things very textbook and very technical, and maybe he's able to do that early in the fight, and maybe he's able to gain some early respect from Prochazka by catching him early on and potentially even knocking him down. I don't think that's out of the question. But the longer this one goes, the more I think that Jiří's pressure is going to give problems to Roundtree in a way that he just doesn't handle it well. And I think that's going to manifest in Jiří either getting a second or third round knockout or potentially winning this fight 29-28 after giving up the first. I think Jiří is the best bet on the card relative to what his price is and the confidence in the grade on him. Even if he ends up becoming 2-1 by fight day, I would still bet him. Submission upside is clearly his. Knockout upside, I think both of these fighters clearly have it, but I still have an easier time picturing it for Prochazka than I do for Roundtree. I think Roundtree, if he knocks him out, it's got to be early. I think Jiří could knock him out at any point in this fight. If this goes the distance, there's the risk that Roundtree was able to keep it technical the whole time. But when has a Jiří fight ever been technical the whole time? I think Jiří's got this. And I think the UFC would much rather see Jiří win than Roundtree because of how much of a star he is and how much he's willing to force the kind of fight that fans love watching. So I've got Prochazka winning. I'm going to say he knocks Roundtree out in round 2 after weathering an early, I don't know about an early storm, but after an ambiguous first round where Roundtree is keeping things measured at first, Jiří turns up the pressure and Roundtree doesn't respond to it well, and Roundtree ends up getting finished in the second half of the second round. So give me Jiří to win by round 2 knockout. Probably going to end up making him a parlay leg because, again, I think for how confident I am in him to win relative to what his value is here, and given so many of the other favorites are already out in the 200, flirting with 300 range already, he's going to be a guy I'm going to need to lean on as a leg on this card for the strategy that I deploy. So I'm riding with Jiří finally, and I'm happy to do it after having picked against the guy so many times, successfully and unsuccessfully, but I think this is a good spot for him. And I'll tell you something else too. If Ankalaev does win, I don't think that they're going to make a trilogy with him and Pereira if Pereira gets the belt back. But if Ankalaev is still champ, given how much Ankalaev likes to keep things conventional, I think Jiří is a nightmare matchup for that guy. Like, probably the biggest threat to dethrone Ankalaev of anybody else in the division, just because he can force Ankalaev into the weird kind of fight that he otherwise doesn't really want to deal with. Jiří's not going to allow him stuff to be clinched to death against the fence for 25 minutes. That would be a crazy fight. And if Jiří's the guy to defeat the Dagestani fence hugger that everybody despises, all the casual fans despise, Jiří would be even more of a hero among the MMA community than he already is. I would love to see that. So I feel pretty good about him doing this, and I don't know if he's going to get a title shot off of this one, but given the win over Hill and the fact that if Pereira moves up to heavyweight, if he loses to Ankalaev, that there's nobody else in the division that's beaten him, and he's coming off of 2 wins removed from his last loss to the guy that's no longer in the division, I would hope they give him a title shot pretty quickly after this, if he hasn't taken too much damage. But give me Prochazka to win by second round knockout. The co-main event at UFC 320 is Merab Dvalishvili and Cory Sandhagen. Merab is 20-4, last defended his bantamweight title at UFC 316 in June, where he completely broke the spirit of Sean O'Malley and submitted him in round 3. It was tragic because Merab overs had been free money for most of his UFC career. So to see O'Malley kind of give up and to concede only the second submission win of Merab's entire MMA career and his first since 2017 was brutal. And it has deterred me enough that I don't even necessarily feel confident in this fight going the distance, even though Mr. Sandhagen himself has only been finished once. Cory Sandhagen is 18-5, beat Davison Figueiredo by injury TKO at UFC Des Moines in May. Prior to that, he had gotten blown out by Umar Nurmagomedov at UFC Abu Dhabi the previous August last year. He will insist that he's the one that initiated the injury that led to Figueiredo's downfall. I mean, I'm inclined to agree with him. I think if you're a Jack Slack fan, if you go back and listen to his recap of that event, he explains it pretty well in terms of what Sandhagen did in order to bring about that injury. So it wasn't like a fluky win or anything, and most people had Sandhagen as a massive favorite in that anyway. I think I took the over. I think I took the over in that one. That was, I have my rule about not hedging on rounds when I have the underdog graded to win. I had a very strong grade on Figgy against Sandhagen, and then I looked at what the price was for Cory, and I'm like, okay, I know based on my gut that this isn't correct. Like it's just not going to happen. I can't chart a path to victory for Figgy, even despite the fact that the variables are telling me that I should pick him as the underdog. So I'm just going to hedge on rounds, and even if I get it wrong, it'll be less embarrassing for me than if I pick the underdog. I've gotten bitten in the butt for not just writing with what the analysis says plenty of times this year. Even in circumstances with big underdogs where I'm not charting a path to victory and neither is the market. But I was correct on that one because that one was a blowout. My analysis has never liked Sandhagen. I think I've not had a favorable grade on him in any of the 5 fights that I've graded him in since I started doing this. I think I've hedged on rounds in most of his cases, but I picked Song Yadong to beat him. That fight was pretty much a blowout. I don't think I picked Cheeto, but I think I took the over in that one. That ended up going to a split. But I'm pretty sure I had Cheeto graded to win. And that fight certainly wasn't a split decision. That was a terrible... Cory clearly won that fight. Font, I think I took the over on that one. That one did end up hitting. I took Umar pretty confidently, even at 300. All the people that love Cory were like... so many people were picking Cory on faith and just blind hatred of Umar and love of Cory in that one. And I don't think Cory won a single round of that fight. I totally agreed with the 50-45. I don't think that had anything to do with Abu Dhabi judges for, the Dagestani fighter or anything else. And then Figgy, I already just went through on that. But Merab isn't necessarily someone that I've had a favorable analysis of either. I've had him graded to win more than a few times, but his money line has always been too high to the point that I just haven't ended up picking him. I had the last fight with O'Malley. It was I didn't have enough confidence in him to bet him in the 200 range, so I just didn't. I passed up on it, and I hedged on rounds, especially because with the Merab ones, it's like, okay, if you think Merab is going to win, then you might as well just bet the over, because nearly all of his UFC fights have gone the distance anyway, and so many of his money lines are getting blown out to where the over is anyway. It's just a better bet to take the over. That's kind of the same way I feel about this one, given Merab is a minus 400 favorite. If you're confident in Cory, go ahead and bet Cory. But I don't know how you can look at what happened in the Umar fight and where, like, Cory was, like, very good at resisting the wrestling of Umar, but still just didn't have anything for him on the feet, where you would have expected him to do more well in the striking given how good of a job he did getting up in the earlier stages of the fight, where I think that, like, Umar's was relentless in that fight in the same way that I expect Merab to be relentless here, to where Cory isn't going to be able to comfortably get anything off to where he'd be able to win a 48-47 decision if it does go the distance. I don't know what you do about Merab, man. I mean, he's getting to the point now where he's pretty much lapped the division. The one guy, this is going to be a little controversial, but the one guy that I think really could give him problems is Bryce Mitchell. I don't know about problems, but Bryce Mitchell, I think, would be a fascinating matchup for Merab, because he does so much of what Merab does. I don't know about equally as well, but in a similar vein as well, and was a big featherweight. If he's comfortably making bantamweight, I mean, the guy's going to be the biggest bantamweight in the division, like, fairly, I think, easily for the kind of style that he deploys. Now, obviously, he's going to run into trouble against striker. Like, someone like Sean O'Malley is going to give Bryce a lot of problems if the fight is staying standing, obviously, because with the way that he got knocked out against Josh Emmett, if he's not able to put the fight on the floor where he would probably have his way with O'Malley, he's probably going to get knocked out, having taken weight off of his chin after suffering a catastrophic knockout like that. But that being said, I don't really, after the way that he dominated a big bantamweight like Nurmagomedov on the ground after getting hurt early, I think he is a problem at bantamweight for a lot of fighters. So if nobody is able to put his lights out, if he does get a matchup with Merab for the title, I don't see Merab knocking him out. And if Merab doesn't knock him out, this turns into a very, very interesting wrestling and grappling festival between two guys with extremely good cardio, and one of them is way bigger than the other one is. That would be a very, very interesting fight, because Bryce isn't going to get tired. Unless Merab, like, hurts him bad early, which I just don't see happening. That's one of the only people I think that has the kind of cardio and ability where Merab is also good to handle dealing with all the mat returns that Merab deploys. That's the most interesting matchup that I think is left for him. And I've spent more time breaking down that hypothetical fight than this one because, like I said, I don't see a path to victory here for Cory, but I also am not confident enough in Merab to bet him at 400 here. If he was inside of 200, I'd probably go ahead with it. But the hype around Merab and just being this cardio freakazoid at this point is just too much for anybody to deal with. The finishing upside, you probably have to go with Cory just because we've seen Merab kind of be a little bit chinny before, even though it hasn't manifested yet. But it's not like Cory has one punch lights out power. He's a dangerous striker. Dangerous 8-limb striker, no doubt. But in terms of anything that's going to put Merab away the way like Marlon Moraes almost did in the first round of their fight, the one punch nuclear option just isn't going to be there. And the longer this one goes, obviously, the more it's going to be in Merab's favor. I think it could be a similar thing to where Cory has early success and then Merab just takes over the last 15 minutes at least to what happened when Merab fought Umar. But I knew Umar was going to handle Cory even as a 350 favorite, and he did. If Cory isn't on the level Umar is, I don't see why he would have the same level of success that Umar did against an opponent like Merab. So I'm going to say Merab wins a 49-46 decision and still. And again, I think a lot of hardcore fans respect how good Merab is and admire his fighting style because it is, I talked about the unorthodox approach with Jiří. That's something as a hardcore fan, you admire what Merab is able to do because nobody else is able to replicate it in terms of just endlessly using mat returns and relentless pressure and pace in the wrestling to exhaust an opponent to where you can basically do whatever you want to them. Nobody else has been able to replicate that the way that Merab is doing, and just the way that he breaks the spirit of his opponents because of how tired they get and how frustrated they get and how much energy they use getting up after getting taken down just to get immediately mat returned again is something that is similar to, I mean, Khabib was a better finisher, but it is a similar way to how all of these Dagestani fighters, not in the mold of Khabib, are able to break the spirit of their opponents. But Merab just does it in a way where he's not really looking for the finish usually, which is why the O'Malley result was kind of such an outlier, but it's just undeniably impressive. But if you're a casual fan, you probably hate it because it's not really fighting as much as it is canceling out the fight in a way that makes it obvious that you're the one that is still dominating it. It's almost like anti-fighting in a way, which in theory is unbecoming of a champion. In practice, it's fascinating to watch when you realize how impressive it is in a display of stamina and just sheer relentlessness. So I don't have anything bad to say about Merab. I respect it a lot, but I can see how it's a style that would frustrate a lot of casual fans, and it just puts the division in a really tough position. It's why it would be funny if, of all the people to save the division from this guy, it would be Bryce Mitchell. I'd like to see it. I don't know who else is really going to be as good of a matchup for Merab given what he's good at this point. But regardless, give me Merab 49-46. Cory takes one of the first two rounds, but championship rounds are going to firmly belong to Merab, I think. Third round is going to firmly belong to Merab. I just don't see him losing this one, even if I give Sandhagen more of the overall finishing upside. Merab is just a force unlike anything we've seen. Freak of nature, surely. And now we come to the main event. Magomed Ankalaev and Alex Pereira 2. Ankalaev is 21-1-1. Took the title off of Pereira at UFC 313, winning what I thought was a pretty clear-cut decision in his favor. Pretty clear, at least 48-47, potentially 49-46, but more likely 48-47. Either way, I didn't think Pereira really had a good argument for winning that fight. There were a lot of people that I think just spitefully thought, out of pure spite for Ankalaev and Dagestani fighters in general and the way that Ankalaev fights, that thought Pereira should have won or at least shouldn't have lost his belt. But I think from a purely objective basis, you had to score that 48-47 Ankalaev, which is funny because, I was hypercritical of the judging on the prelims of that card, but I thought they nailed it in the main event. Man, It is funny, though, because Ankalaev was the slight underdog in that fight. It was, kind of around the pick'em range, but, I saw a lot of sharp people that recognized, this is kind of the end of road for Pereira. And I could even tell that they were, for as long as they were keeping Ankalaev out of a title shot that he otherwise deserved, and given the other fights he was dominating in the meantime, waiting for it, I thought it was kind of crazy that, he didn't get the shot sooner than maybe he otherwise deserved it. So yeah, I do feel like they were protecting Pereira from him for a little bit, but the fight was still very interesting and is something, and for two key stats from that fight that I think bear an interesting outlook on how this one potentially plays out. The first one is one that a lot of people point to, and why people that are backing Pereira as an underdog are confident again, and rightfully so, which is that if you took Ankalaev as the underdog the first time, you did it expecting that Ankalaev was going to be able to, when the fight got to the ground, it was going to stay there, Pereira wasn't going to get up, and that you were a believer in Ankalaev's wrestling. There were a lot of people that believed then and still believe now that Ankalaev's wrestling is a little bit overrated relative to the usual Dagestani standard. I think that's a fair assessment, and it was reflected in what happened in the fight because Ankalaev went 0 for 10 on takedowns, which is kind of crazy. I mean, he didn't land a single takedown in that fight. He shot 10 attempts, but the attempts still went a long way in terms of him being able to get in against the fence, hold the fight against the fence, and keep the fight from getting out into space to where Pereira would have otherwise been the most effective. So that's one side of it. A lot of people believe that, they say Alex had a terrible letdown performance. He kind of let the fight get away from him. He wasn't throwing enough. And that's true, but I don't think they go far enough in terms of how much of a letdown performance it was for Pereira, because so many of the people that picked Pereira did it on the basis that they were expecting him to put Ankalaev out in a way that we hadn't seen happen to Ankalaev before. That, he had the left hook. He's Poton for a reason. It's like Joe Rogan says, he's made out of wood. He's built different in terms of the way that he's hitting people. It's not normal, which is fair and still probably hasn't left him. But if I told you that Alex Pereira was going to only land 10 times to the head in a 25-minute fight against a guy like Ankalaev, would you have picked him to win? That's the biggest concern for me looking at this fight, is that Ankalaev totally took away where Pereira otherwise would have been more effective. And the other key thing, not really reflected as a stat, but just what the biggest moment of the fight was towards the end of the second round, when Ankalaev was the only guy in the fight that really visibly hurt and affected one of the two of them. And that he gained enough respect from that exchange where it was evident that Pereira's tentativeness was not going to do him any favors the rest of the time. That fight ultimately came down to how you scored round 3. I didn't think that Pereira did enough to put a stamp on the round to where he would have earned it over how Ankalaev kind of controlled how it played out. Not even just with control time, but just, keeping it on his terms. Pereira simply did not engage enough. I don't think either guy really fought to their potential in that fight, if I'm being honest, but Ankalaev, having the more well-rounded skill set, was still able to get the job done on that sheer basis. I still expect him to be the better fighter in the clinch and when the fight is on the fence. If the fight goes to the ground, it's no question who's going to be the more effective one between the two of them. I still think Ankalaev is the more defensively responsible between the two of them. He's 5 years younger, and he's in a better stage of his career than Pereira is. There's a talking point going into this that, has Pereira really just gotten too caught up in, trotting the globe and, being this guy that's arguably, even without the belt, still one of, if not the biggest stars in the UFC? like just being internationally recognized and enjoying that too much. And I didn't really want to buy into it too much, even with people making a big deal about him doing the skits with Nina Drama, which I made the joke after getting burned by the fighting nerds that, oh, they did that stupid aura farming thing with them down at their gym, and they went 0-3 in main and co-main events after they did that. That was me just kind of taking the piss at myself and being a bit of a coping mechanism for, you know, having a bad read on how their fights were actually going to go. And, you know, I don't blame Nina Drama for that. I'm not saying I enjoy seeing her, you know, be the succubus of the UFC, if you know what I mean. But I don't blame. If Pereira loses this again, I'm not going to blame it on Nina Drama, even though everybody's going to say it was the Nina Drama curse. The thing that more concerns me in terms of where Pereira's head is at going into this rematch is that he admitted in one of the lead-up interviews this week that he said, I don't know how much longer I'm going to be able to cut to 205. And the speculation has been that if he loses this fight, he's going to go to heavyweight, which makes total sense because not only is that division remarkably shallow, but for being in your late 30s, you have much more of an extension of your career in MMA if you're fighting at heavyweight than any other weight class. And I mean, him versus Aspinall, that's one of the biggest fights the UFC can make right now. It just is. That would be an incredible headliner for the White House card, assuming they just give Pereira a direct title shot, which would kind of be ridiculous if he doesn't get a fight in between then and doesn't even debut at heavyweight, but forgivable in the sense that if Aspinall beats Gane, he's already cleared out the division at that point because the only other fight they could make at that point is a rematch between him and Volkov, and John Jones is out of the picture. The division is so bare in the cupboard that it's like, okay, if Pereira is the biggest name we can give him, we might as well do it. But he having admitted that he's already 1 foot out the door, it's not the same checking out as when a fighter admits that they're going to be retiring or whatever. But it is still on his mind at this point that he's thinking that I'm not going to be able to do this at this weight class forever. That was not something that he had coming into when no way he was thinking about that when he was champion. Maybe he was prior to losing the belt, but he didn't admit it publicly. But it's one thing for us to speculate about him going to heavyweight given the age that he is at, having just turned 38 in, I think, July. But now him having admitted it publicly, it's clear that it's something that has affected him enough to the point that he's, you know, openly addressed it and expressed that emotion. That was not something that was known prior to him fighting Ankalaev. Ankalaev's not going anywhere. Why would he? I don't see anybody other than Jiří giving this guy a problem at light heavyweight, which many people like to refer to as a division that almost every fighter, even the contenders, have terrible fight IQ. Even the guy that would have the best shot at beating Ankalaev, in my estimation, is infamous for, you know, blocking strikes with his head and forcing the issue in a way that puts him at incredible risk. Pereira is the closest thing to a point fighter at light heavyweight, and if he leaves, Ankalaev has got to get through Jiří, and then he could be champion for years. Honestly, you think Navajo Sterling is going to rise through the ranks and beat Magomed Ankalaev? I don't see Roundtree giving him problems either. Especially, like, you want to talk about Ankalaev, you want to talk about Roundtree potentially getting tested by somebody that will actually take him down. I don't think Ankalaev is going 0 for 10 on takedowns in a fight with Roundtree the way that he did against Pereira. So somebody told me that they were like, oh, 260, this is objectively a bad bet. Why? Probably because you like Pereira. Okay. I was confident Ankalaev was going to win the first one. I don't even think he had his best potential performance. I know Pereira didn't. But given the stages of their career that they're at, who do you think has a better ability to have a better fight, and a potentially better fight in this one on their terms? The guy that's 33 years old that just beat this guy earlier this year? Or the guy that lost his belt to an opponent that the UFC protected him from for several years, that has already acknowledged that he's thinking about leaving the division to go the next weight up, given the stage of his career that he's at? I could Pereira knock him out? Sure. But I think that the knockout upside here is pretty equal, especially given the last fight we saw. The only moment where somebody actually got hurt was the guy that's champion now hurting Pereira. And if this goes the distance, I could see it being another similarly close fight where Ankalaev is, he gets to the point where he feels comfortable that he's banked at least 3 of the rounds, that he just kind of keeps himself out of danger and never lets Pereira get off a kill shot or put himself in a position to lose. Now, Pereira could come out and just go out of his way to try kicking the low leg kicks, and that would probably serve him very well. But one of the reasons I felt so good about picking Ankalaev last time was people were saying that in the last fight about Pereira potentially throwing the low leg kicks. And we saw against Blachowicz, he was still able to fight it back to a draw that most people thought Ankalaev still should have been scored the win, despite the fact that for the first half of the fight, especially the first 2 rounds, Blachowicz won it largely on just kicking out Ankalaev's legs, and people thinking, oh, Ankalaev's got nothing left in his legs at this point. And then he rallies back. He controls the fight, gets a 10-8 in the 5th, and that's why it ends up as a draw. So even when we've seen Ankalaev get hurt on his legs, which has kind of been shown to be his weakness or whatever, he's still shown enough grit to be able to battle himself back and have an argument for winning a fight, and probably should have won the fight. It just kind of got scored a draw because I think it was pretty clear that the UFC was like, we can't let this guy be champion for this long, because his style, Ankalaev doesn't have a nickname. His nickname should be the Hypnotist. The last fight with Pereira is the first time I've ever watched an Ankalaev fight and I haven't fallen asleep. It was funny because I was watching the pay-per-view with my brother, and my brother fell asleep. This guy puts everybody to sleep, not with submissions, not with his hands, but just by fighting the most boring style possible, but being too good at it. This is who Magomed Ankalaev is. He is a promotional nightmare for the UFC, but he's a damn good fighter. He just is. It's a bitter pill to swallow, but you know what? As I said earlier in this show, those guys that you know they're going to fight to their strengths and put themselves in the best position to win, those are the guys you love to bet on. I love betting them as an underdog, and I don't see enough that has changed between this fight, or the last fight and this one, to think that it's going to go any differently. I wouldn't bet Ankalaev in 300 range, but I feel good about him enough with the dynamic finishing upside and potential to win a decision here as he already has, that I feel good about betting him in 200. So give me Magomed Ankalaev to win another unanimous decision. I'll say that Pereira has another good first round. Ankalaev makes the adjustments that he needs to, but I'll actually say that Pereira doesn't have as effective of a 5th round this time, and that Ankalaev ends up getting a 49-46, taking the last 4 rounds in convincing fashion. So I'll look forward to seeing Pereira at heavyweight, and I hope Jiří wins, and I would love to see Jiří be the guy to dethrone this Russian supervillain, the Hypnotist, Magomed Ankalaev. All right, that's going to do it for the MMA RAXPOD. Thank you very much for tuning in. Again, please like, share, and subscribe if you haven't already. We'll be back in a couple of weeks for UFC 321, which will be, I believe, Aspinall versus Cyril Gane. That is a much more exciting fight, exciting card overall than this one, in my estimation. Gosh, man, I'm going to be rooting so hard for Veretina against Mackenzie Dern. I look so forward to breaking that one down. Umar versus Mario Batista. You know I love me some Mario Batista. I'm going to be rooting for him so hard in that one, even if I think Umar's probably going to end up taking that. Volkov Almeida is obviously very interesting. Mirzakhanov Rakic is a banger. I mean, if Mirzakhanov wins that fight, it's a very interesting way that could go. Junyoung Park, my boy, the Iron Turtle, against Ikram Alaskarov is the featured prelim. That card is loaded. And we have fight of the year, Chris Barnett versus Hamdi Abdelwahab. Does that fight probably get canceled? I would imagine it does. But if it doesn't, we have one of the sloppiest heavyweight fights of all time on our hands, and I can't wait to see that one. The opening fight is Jose Delgado, Nathaniel Wood. I mean, I'm more excited for all of those fights I just mentioned than every other fight on this card other than Prochazka Roundtree. That's how good 321 is. So make sure you come back for that one. I can't wait to break it down for you. But yeah, to make sure that you're tuned in for that one, please make sure you like, share, and subscribe to the channel. Follow on X. I appreciate all your support so much. Thank you for tuning in. This definitely went over the 2 hours. I was trying to keep it under, but you know how it goes at this point. I just hope I'm able to get it up at a reasonable hour tonight for you all to appreciate. So thank you very much. I got to go cut this up and post it, and then I got to do another show. I got to do my daily show for my other gig, and I hope you've enjoyed tuning into that one. But yeah, we'll be back for 321 in a couple of weeks, and good luck with all your bets this weekend. Take care, folks.